Hey guys! Tonight we will see how people lose their virginity in medieval Europe. Before that, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comment where you tuning from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. The evening bells echo across a quiet medieval village as the last glow of sunset fades behind stone cottages and rolling fields. A wedding feast has just ended, candles flicker in the windows, and somewhere beyond a heavy oak door, two newlyweds are about to begin a moment that medieval Europe surrounded with customs, expectations, and centuries of myths. But how did people really lose their virginity in the Middle Ages? Was it anything like the stories we've heard, or has history remembered it all wrong? Tonight, we'll gently uncover the truth, leaving the legends behind as we step into the surprisingly ordinary lives of medieval people. What virginity meant in medieval Europe. The meaning of virginity. Tonight, let us step quietly into the world of medieval Europe, a world where the day began with church bells, where most people lived in small villages or modest towns, and where life moved with the slow rhythm of the seasons. Imagine a landscape of fields, forests, rivers, and stone churches, where families had often lived for generations and where nearly everyone knew the names, stories, and reputations of their neighbors. Our journey is not about kings, queens, or famous battles. It is about ordinary people, the farmers, millers, shepherds, bakers, weavers, carpenters, and servants who made up the vast majority of medieval society. And it is about a question that was far more important to them than many modern people realize. What did virginity actually mean in medieval Europe? To understand how people lost their virginity in medieval Europe, we must first understand what medieval people believed they were losing. The word virginity did not simply describe a physical condition. It carried religious, social, legal, and emotional meanings that shaped the lives of millions of people. For many medieval Europeans, virginity was closely connected to marriage, honor, family reputation, inheritance, and the teachings of the Christian Church. As dawn spreads across the fields, imagine yourself as a young person growing up in a small medieval community. You have spent your childhood helping your family with everyday tasks, gathering firewood, carrying water, tending animals, spinning wool, grinding grain, or working in the fields during harvest. You know the church bell that marks the hours of prayer. You know the market day that brings travelers from neighboring villages. You know the faces of nearly everyone around you. In such a world, privacy was limited. People lived close to one another, worked together, worshipped together, and observed one another constantly. A person's reputation was not an abstract idea, it was something that could affect marriage prospects, family relationships, and standing within the community. Because of this, virginity was often understood not only as a personal matter, but as something connected to the honor of an entire household. The Church played a central role in shaping these ideas. Throughout much of medieval Europe, the Church taught that sexual relations properly belonged within marriage. Priests preached about chastity before marriage and fidelity afterward. Virginity was praised in religious writings, especially in connection with saints and the Virgin Mary, whose purity held enormous spiritual significance in medieval Christian culture. Yet the medieval world was not simply divided into pure and impure. It was more subtle than that. Marriage itself was considered honorable. The Church did not teach that sexuality was inherently sinful, rather, it taught that sexual relations had a proper place within marriage. For most ordinary people, the expected path was clear: grow up, learn the work of adult life, marry, and begin a household. Losing virginity was therefore usually understood as part of entering married life, not as a separate adventure or personal milestone in the modern sense. As the morning continues, imagine walking through the village lane. An elderly woman hangs herbs beneath her roof. A blacksmith's hammer rings softly in the distance. children chase one another between cottages. The smell of bread rises from a nearby oven. In this ordinary setting, families quietly watch the younger generation growing older. A young woman who has become skilled at baking, brewing, spinning, and managing household tasks begins to be seen differently. A young man who has learned farming, carpentry, smithing, or another trade begins to attract attention as someone capable of supporting a household. Courtship often begins not with dramatic declarations, but with familiarity, work, trust, and the slow recognition that two people might someday marry. Virginity mattered because marriage mattered. For women especially, virginity before marriage was frequently associated with modesty, chastity, and good reputation. Medieval literature, sermons, and legal customs often placed greater emphasis on female virginity than on male virginity. This was connected to concerns about inheritance and legitimacy. In a world where land, property, and family lineage were extremely important, certainty about parentage mattered greatly. A bride was therefore often expected to enter marriage with a reputation for chastity. This does not mean that every medieval woman was a virgin before marriage, nor that every community treated the issue in exactly the same way. Medieval Europe was remarkably diverse. Customs differed between villages and cities, between northern and southern Europe, and between different centuries. Historians who study church court records have found many cases involving broken marriage promises, premarital relationships, and disputes over sexual conduct. Real life was often far more complicated than moral ideals. Men were judged differently. Although the church expected chastity from both men and women, medieval society often applied those expectations unevenly. A young man might face criticism for immoral behavior, but a woman's sexual reputation usually had more direct consequences for her marriage prospects and family honor. This difference appears repeatedly in medieval literature, legal records, and social customs. As the sun climbs higher, imagine sitting beside a village church. The churchyard is quiet except for birdsong and the distant sound of workers in the fields. An old priest speaks gently with a group of young people about marriage. He does not describe it as a romance from a song. He describes it as a vocation, a calling, and the foundation of a household. A husband and wife are expected to share labor, food, shelter, responsibilities, and eventually children. The first sexual experience is understood within this larger framework. It is not presented as an isolated event, but as the beginning of married life together. This is one of the most important historical truths about medieval Europe. For many ordinary people, losing virginity was not imagined as becoming experienced in the modern sense. It was imagined as entering a new social and religious status, becoming a husband or a wife. The change was connected to vows, family, community recognition, and the creation of a household. Knowledge about the body was often limited and uneven. Most people did not receive formal education about sexuality. Medical texts existed, and some clergy discussed marital obligations, but ordinary villagers usually learned through observation, conversation, and the quiet guidance of older relatives. Mothers, aunts, older sisters, and experienced married women often prepared brides in gentle, practical ways. Fathers, uncles, and older men did the same for grooms. Much was left unspoken, and many young couples entered marriage with uncertainty as well as hope. As evening approaches, the village grows quieter. Smoke curls from chimneys, animals are brought into their enclosures, and families gather around hearth fires where bread, pottage, cheese, and ale make up the evening meal. Stories are told, tools are repaired, and tomorrow's work is quietly planned. Outside, the stars begin to appear above the dark fields. In the stillness of the night, you begin to understand that virginity in medieval Europe was not merely about the body. It was about belonging to a family, to a community, to a faith, and eventually to a marriage. It was tied to reputation, responsibility, and the hope of building a household that might endure through harvests, winters, illness, and the passing of generations. Only after understanding that quiet and deeply rooted meaning can we begin to explore the path by which most ordinary people in medieval Europe eventually lost their virginity. And that path begins, as so many medieval stories do, with the slow journey toward marriage. Growing up before marriage. As night settles gently over the medieval countryside, the village grows quiet in a way that is difficult to imagine today. The last embers of the evening fire glow softly inside the cottages. Animals rest in their sheds, doors are barred against the cold, and the only sounds are the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of wind through the trees, and the occasional toll of a church bell marking the passing hours. In this peaceful darkness, we continue our journey through the world of medieval Europe, where the path toward losing one's virginity usually began long before a wedding day arrived. Imagine yourself growing older in this village. At first, nothing seems different. You still help carry water from the well, gather firewood, tend chickens or sheep, and work beside your family in the fields. Childhood in medieval Europe often blended gradually into adulthood. There was rarely a single moment when everyone suddenly declared that you had become a grown man or woman. Instead, responsibility accumulated quietly, season by season. For a young woman, this might mean learning to bake bread, brew ale, spin wool, weave cloth, preserve food, care for younger children, and manage the many small tasks that kept a household alive. For a young man, it might mean plowing fields, repairing fences, caring for livestock, cutting timber, working in a workshop, or serving as an apprentice under an experienced craftsman. These skills were not merely useful, they were essential for marriage. In medieval Europe, a marriage was expected to create a functioning household. A husband and wife would need food, shelter, clothing, tools, and often land or employment. They would need to survive winter, harvest failure, illness, and the ordinary hardships of life. Because of this, many families thought carefully about whether a young person was truly ready to marry. Readiness was measured not only by age, but by the ability to contribute to a household and to live responsibly within the community. This is why the years before marriage were so important. As you walk through the village in the early morning, people begin to notice you differently. Neighbors who once saw only a child now see a young adult. An elderly woman comments that you have become capable. A farmer asks for your help with a more difficult task. The village priest greets you with greater seriousness. Nothing dramatic has happened, yet the community quietly recognizes that you are approaching the stage of life when marriage may soon become possible. For most ordinary people, this was the period when courtship slowly began. Courtship in medieval Europe was often gentle, public, and deeply connected to everyday life. Young people met while working in the fields, tending animals, attending church, participating in harvest celebrations, dancing during seasonal festivals, or visiting local markets. Because villages were usually small, people saw one another repeatedly over many years. Affection could grow through familiarity rather than sudden romance. A young man might notice that a particular young woman was hardworking, kind to children, and respected by her neighbors. A young woman might notice that a certain young man repaired tools willingly, treated older people with respect, and worked steadily even when no one was watching. These observations mattered greatly. Marriage was expected to last a lifetime, and character was often considered as important as attraction. Contrary to many modern assumptions, medieval Europe was not a world where young people were constantly left alone together. Families and neighbors paid attention. A couple walking together after church, speaking frequently at the village well, or spending time together during festivals would often be noticed by the community. Reputation grew from these small observations. This did not mean that love was absent. Medieval songs, poems, letters, and stories show that people experienced longing, affection, jealousy, tenderness, and deep emotional attachment. But these emotions existed within a society that strongly connected sexual relations with marriage. For many ordinary people, the expectation was that virginity would be preserved until a wedding had taken place. As the afternoon sun warms the fields, imagine sitting beside an older relative while repairing a basket or spinning wool. The older woman speaks quietly about marriage. She does not describe it in dramatic or mysterious language. Instead, she speaks about patience, cooperation, and kindness. She explains how households are managed, how disagreements are softened, how children require endless care, and how two people gradually learn to share their lives. Knowledge about sexuality was often transmitted in exactly this quiet way. Most medieval people did not receive formal lessons about sexual relations. There were no school classes devoted to the subject, and many ordinary villagers could not read. Information was passed through conversation, observation, experience, and the gentle guidance of older relatives. Mothers, aunts, grandmothers, older sisters, and experienced married women often prepared a bride for marriage in practical terms. Fathers, uncles, older brothers, and respected men in the community did the same for a groom. The result was that many young couples entered marriage with only partial understanding. They usually knew that marriage involved becoming husband and wife in every sense, but they might know relatively little about the practical details of their first night together. This is an important historical point. The first sexual experience for many medieval Europeans was often accompanied by uncertainty, nervousness, curiosity, and hope rather than confidence. As evening approaches, the church bell rings once across the village. People return from the fields carrying tools and bundles of grain. Bread is placed on the table, pottage is stirred over the fire, and the household gathers together. In the flickering light of the hearth, conversations turn toward the future. Parents quietly discuss which families are trustworthy, which young people have good reputations, and who seems ready for marriage. These discussions are not always arranged marriages in the dramatic sense often shown in films. Among ordinary villagers, young people frequently had some opportunity to know and even choose a future spouse, though family approval remained extremely important. Because marriage was usually expected to precede sexual relations, the journey toward losing virginity was also a journey toward community recognition. A wedding was not only a private event between two individuals. It was a public acknowledgement that a new household was being created. The village, the church, and both families all became witnesses to that new status. Virginity was therefore connected not only to the body, but to a change in social identity. A young woman became a wife. A young man became a husband. They became responsible for one another and for the household they would build together. As darkness settles once more over the medieval landscape, you stand quietly outside a cottage and look up at the stars. The fields are silent. The church tower rises above the village, and the night seems endless and calm. You now understand something that is easy to overlook from the modern world. Before most ordinary medieval Europeans lost their virginity, they spent years preparing for adulthood. They learned work, responsibility, cooperation, and the expectations of their community. They were observed by neighbors, guided by family, shaped by religious teaching, and slowly drawn toward marriage. For many of them, virginity was not something they expected to lose during youth as an experiment or adventure. They expected to lose it when they crossed the threshold into married life. And in the next chapter, we will begin following that quiet path toward marriage itself, where harvests, festivals, and the watchful eyes of family and neighbors gently guided countless ordinary people toward the moment that medieval society considered the proper beginning of sexual life. The path toward marriage. When the village began to notice you. The seasons have turned quietly since our last evening together. The harvest fields that were once green have become golden, and the golden fields have slowly given way to the softer colors of early autumn. The mornings are cooler now. A gentle mist gathers over the meadows before the sun lifts it away, and the church bell carries farther through the crisp air than it did during summer. In medieval Europe, the passing of a season was never merely a change in weather. It was also a measure of life itself. People grew older between one harvest and the next, children became workers, and workers gradually became adults. Imagine once again that you are an ordinary young person living somewhere in medieval Europe during the late Middle Ages. Your village is small enough that everyone recognizes your face. The same families have lived here for generations, and every path, field, and stream carries memories that belong not only to you, but to your parents and grandparents as well. You have begun to notice that people speak to you differently now. The older women at the village well no longer treat you as a child. They ask whether you have learned to keep accounts for the household, whether you can preserve vegetables for winter, whether you know how to care for a sick animal or mend a torn garment. The older men speak with you about fields, tools, weather, and responsibility. Their questions are gentle, but they reveal something important. The village has begun to notice that you are approaching the age when marriage will soon become possible. In medieval Europe, this change rarely happened suddenly. There was no universal birthday that transformed a child into an adult. Instead, adulthood emerged gradually through work, reputation, and the ability to contribute to a household. A young woman became increasingly visible as a potential bride when she demonstrated skill in baking, brewing, spinning, weaving, gardening, and managing domestic tasks. A young man became increasingly visible as a potential husband when he showed reliability in farming, craftsmanship, trade, or other forms of labor that could support a family. The church bell rings for morning prayers, and villagers begin walking toward the small stone church that stands at the center of the community. The path is familiar beneath your feet. You have walked it since childhood, first holding a parent's hand, later running with friends, and now walking with a quieter awareness of the people around you. After the service, no one rushes home immediately. The churchyard becomes a place of conversation. Neighbors exchange news, discuss the weather, comment on the harvest, and quietly observe the younger generation. This was one of the most common places where courtship began, not through dramatic declarations, but through repeated encounters under the eyes of family and community. A young man might offer to carry a basket. A young woman might pause to speak beside the church gate. A conversation about grain, sheep, or market prices could slowly become a conversation that happened every Sunday. Historians who study medieval parish records often find evidence that many couples knew one another for a long time before marriage. In small villages, there were few strangers. Most people married someone who lived nearby, whose family was already known, and whose character had been observed over many years. As the afternoon unfolds, the village prepares for a seasonal gathering. Harvest celebrations were important throughout medieval Europe. After weeks of labor in the fields, communities often held feasts, dances, games, and religious observances that marked the successful completion of the harvest. These gatherings brought together young people from neighboring farms and villages, creating opportunities for conversation that everyday work did not always allow. Imagine lanterns being lit as evening approaches. Musicians tune simple instruments. Bread, cheese, roasted meat, and ale are placed on long wooden tables. Children chase one another through the grass while older villagers sit together telling stories of past harvests and hard winters. You join a circle of young people near the edge of the gathering. Someone begins a slow dance. The movements are modest and communal rather than intimate, and older relatives watch with quiet interest. Courtship in medieval Europe was often surprisingly public. A couple who spent time together was usually observed by siblings, parents, neighbors, and friends. Reputation grew from these repeated observations, and families paid close attention to who seemed respectful, hard-working, and trustworthy. This public nature of courtship is one reason historians believe that, for many ordinary people, the path toward losing virginity was closely tied to marriage. A relationship did not usually develop in complete secrecy. Instead, it gradually became known within the community, and that knowledge often led to conversations between families. As the music continues, an older woman smiles knowingly at two young people who have danced together more than once. Nothing is said aloud. Yet everyone understands. In a village, affection rarely remained hidden for very long. As the celebration ends and people begin walking home beneath a sky filled with stars, you notice that the village feels different than it did a year ago. The paths are the same, the cottages are the same, the church tower is the same, and yet you have changed. You are no longer simply someone's child. You are becoming someone who may one day form a household of your own. This was a deeply significant transition in medieval Europe. Marriage was not merely a romantic event, it was the beginning of economic cooperation, family responsibility, and social recognition. The first sexual experience was therefore usually understood as part of this larger transformation rather than as an isolated moment of personal exploration. The night grows quiet. A cool wind moves across the harvested fields, carrying the scent of straw and damp earth. The church bell sounds once more in the distance, and one by one the lights in the cottages disappear. You stand for a moment beneath the stars, listening to the silence. The village has begun to notice you. And without haste, without spectacle, and almost without your realizing it, you have taken the first true step along the path that led most ordinary medieval Europeans toward marriage, adulthood, and the beginning of their intimate lives. Families, reputation, and choosing a spouse. The morning after the harvest gathering arrived quietly. A thin veil of mist rested over the fields, and the stubble left behind by the recent harvest glowed pale silver in the dawn light. The village seemed unchanged, yet for many young people, something subtle had begun to shift. A dance shared beneath lanterns, a conversation after church, or a walk along the lane toward the well could remain in the minds of families long after the music had faded. In medieval Europe, the path toward losing one's virginity usually did not begin with secrecy or rebellion. For most ordinary people, it began with a question that parents and neighbors gradually started asking: would these two make a good household together? Imagine that you are walking through the village once again. The same cottages stand along the lane, their timber frames darkened by years of smoke and weather. Chickens scratch beneath fences, geese wander near the pond, and the smell of fresh bread drifts from a nearby oven. You have known these sights since childhood, but now the village is looking at you with different eyes. The older generation has begun to notice not only who you are, but who you spend time with. A father repairing a cartwheel pauses when you pass with a young woman from a neighboring farm. A mother drawing water from the well remembers that a certain young man always offers to carry the heavier bucket. An elderly widow sitting outside her cottage quietly observes who lingers after church and who walks home together after evening prayers. In a small medieval community, reputation was built from hundreds of tiny moments. This is one of the reasons historians often describe medieval courtship as a deeply communal process. Unlike many modern relationships, which can begin between strangers and develop privately, relationships in medieval villages usually grew in full view of family, neighbors, employers, and the parish community. Everyone knew where you lived, who your parents were, how hard you worked, and whether you kept your promises. As the sun rises higher, you help gather apples from a small orchard. Nearby, another family is doing the same, and conversations pass easily across the rows of trees. A young man asks about the condition of your family's fields. You ask about the health of his father. An older woman jokes that the two of you have spoken often this autumn. No one laughs loudly. The joke is gentle because everyone understands its meaning. For many ordinary people, this was how a relationship slowly became known. The important thing was not simply attraction. Medieval families usually cared deeply about character. Was this person dependable? Honest? Respectful toward parents? Capable of hard work? Free from serious disputes with neighbors? Could they help support a household through difficult winters and uncertain harvests? Marriage was expected to last for life. Because of that, practical qualities were often valued as highly as romantic feeling. This does not mean that love was absent from medieval Europe. Surviving letters, poems, songs, and stories show that people experienced affection, longing, tenderness, jealousy, and deep emotional attachment. But those emotions were usually understood within a world where marriage involved land, labor, inheritance, children, and the cooperation of two extended families. By midday, imagine entering a modest cottage where a family is eating bread, cheese, onions, and a pot of barley pottage. The conversation turns toward the future. A mother remarks that a neighboring household has a hard-working daughter. A father observes that a certain young man has nearly completed his apprenticeship. An older sibling mentions that the village priest seems to think they would make a sensible match. These conversations were often cautious rather than forceful. Popular imagination sometimes portrays medieval marriage as entirely arranged by parents, but the reality was more varied. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially during the later Middle Ages, the consent of the bride and groom was considered important, particularly under church law. Families often influenced choices strongly, yet young people frequently knew one another and had opportunities to express preference before a marriage was finalized. As afternoon light stretches across the fields, you accompany your father to repair a boundary fence. He works quietly for a long time before speaking. A household is built from small habits, he says. Anyone can appear pleasant for a single festival. The question is whether they remain kind during a hard winter. You continue tying branches into place. He adds, when people choose a spouse, they are choosing the person who will share sickness, harvest failure, old age, and the raising of children. This quiet wisdom reflects the practical nature of medieval marriage. For most ordinary Europeans, losing virginity was not imagined as an adventure separate from the rest of life. It was usually expected to occur after a wedding, within a relationship that would also involve shared work, shared food, shared shelter, and the hope of future generations. As evening approaches, the church bell rings for vespers. Villagers gather once more, and afterward many remain in the churchyard speaking softly beneath the fading light. An elderly priest watches the younger generation with gentle understanding. He has seen this pattern many times. Children grow. Young people begin walking together. Families begin talking. Promises are discussed. Engagements are considered. Weddings are planned. Households are formed. The rhythm has repeated across generations. In the weeks that follow, you notice that conversations become slightly more intentional. A family from a neighboring farm visits your household for supper. Bread is broken together, ale is shared, and ordinary topics, whether livestock, tools, market prices, fill most of the evening. Yet beneath the ordinary conversation lies another purpose. The families are observing one another. They are asking, without asking directly, whether trust exists between them. In medieval Europe, trust mattered enormously. A marriage joined not only two individuals but also two networks of relatives, obligations, and mutual support. During illness, childbirth, harvest labor, or financial difficulty, families often depended on one another. A good marriage strengthened those bonds. This is why reputation before marriage was so important. A young woman known for honesty, diligence, and kindness entered marriage with social capital that benefited her future household. A young man known for reliability, skill, and self-control did the same. Virginity was part of that broader reputation, especially for women, but it was rarely the only factor. Medieval people cared about the whole person, character, work, faith, family, and the ability to contribute to a stable household. As darkness settles over the village, you walk slowly along the lane between the fields. The air smells of damp earth and wood smoke. Stars appear above the church tower, and the distant sound of a mill wheel turns steadily beside the stream. You realize that nothing dramatic has happened. No vows have been spoken. No wedding has taken place. No great declaration has echoed across the fields. And yet the path has become clearer. For countless ordinary people across medieval Europe, this was the true beginning of the journey toward marriage and eventually toward losing their virginity. It began with being noticed by the community, trusted by another family, and gradually recognized as someone ready to build a household. The night grows still. One by one, the cottage lights disappear. The church bell sounds once more across the quiet fields, and the village settles into peaceful darkness, carrying within it the hopes, expectations, and quiet preparations of another generation moving gently toward adulthood. In the next chapter, we will continue that journey by exploring the promises that came before the wedding itself, engagements, betrothals, and the customs that slowly brought two people to the threshold of marriage in medieval Europe. Promises before the wedding. Betrothals and spoken vows. The autumn fields have now grown quiet. The last wagons of grain have been brought into the barns, orchards have been harvested, and the long evenings have returned to the villages of medieval Europe. Smoke rises steadily from cottage chimneys, and the smell of wood fires lingers in the cool air. The pace of life has slowed after the labor of harvest, leaving time for conversations that were often postponed during the busiest months of the year. Imagine yourself once again as an ordinary young person somewhere in medieval Europe during the late Middle Ages. You have spent years working beside your family, attending church, participating in seasonal festivals, and gradually becoming known within your community. Neighbors recognize your face. Older people greet you by name. Children now look up to you as someone older than themselves. You have reached the stage of life when marriage is no longer a distant idea. It has become a subject of quiet discussion. This is the point where many medieval Europeans entered one of the most important stages of their lives, the betrothal, or formal promise of marriage. Today we often think of an engagement as a romantic announcement between two people. In medieval Europe, it was usually much more than that. A betrothal was a public declaration that a couple intended to marry, and in many places it carried significant legal and religious weight. The promise itself could be taken very seriously, especially when made before witnesses. The morning begins with the familiar sound of church bells. You walk through the village lane, where frost clings to the edges of the grass. A neighbor is repairing a fence, another is feeding chickens, and an elderly woman is hanging herbs to dry near her doorway. The village appears peaceful, yet beneath the ordinary routine, families are beginning to make plans for the future. A father visits another household. A mother quietly asks whether a certain young man has completed his apprenticeship. An uncle speaks with the village priest. These conversations are gentle, practical, and often unhurried. Medieval marriages were rarely arranged in a single afternoon. They usually emerged from months, and sometimes years, of observation, trust, and discussion between families. For many ordinary people, the decision to marry was connected to the ability to establish a household. A young man might wait until he had access to land, tools, livestock, or stable employment. A young woman might wait until she was considered capable of managing the many responsibilities of domestic life. Marriage was expected to create a working partnership, not merely a romantic union. As the sun rises higher, imagine sitting beside a small fire while two families share a meal together. Bread is passed from hand to hand. Cheese, onions, and ale are placed on the table. The conversation begins with weather, harvest yields, and the condition of the roads leading to the nearest market town. Gradually, Almost without anyone announcing it directly, the discussion turns toward the young couple. They have been seen together after church. They have worked side by side during harvest. They have shown respect toward both families. No one speaks dramatically. Instead, an older man says, "They seem well suited." An older woman nods. They are patient with one another. This quiet approval was often one of the most important moments in the medieval path toward marriage. Historians who study church court records have found that many couples were already well known to their communities before a formal wedding took place. Their relationship was not a secret, it was something gradually recognized by the people around them. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval Europe is the importance of spoken words. In a society where many ordinary people could not read or write, a spoken promise could carry enormous significance. A couple who exchanged present-tense marriage vows, words equivalent to "I take you as my husband" or "I take you as my wife," might be considered married under medieval canon law, even if a church ceremony had not yet occurred. The church eventually worked to regulate and formalize marriage more carefully, but throughout much of the Middle Ages, the power of spoken consent remained remarkably important. Imagine the village priest speaking quietly with the couple. He asks whether they freely wish to marry. He reminds them that marriage is a lifelong union. He speaks of faithfulness, mutual support, and the responsibilities of a household. The couple listens with seriousness. For medieval Europeans, marriage was not only a social arrangement, it was also a religious commitment. The church viewed it as a sacred bond, and many people believed that entering marriage brought them into a new moral and spiritual state. As afternoon light stretches across the fields, preparations begin for a small gathering. Neighbors are invited. Relatives arrive from nearby villages. Nothing is lavish, yet everything feels meaningful. The young couple stands before their families and trusted witnesses. They exchange simple words of promise. Hands may be joined. Blessings may be spoken. Gifts may be given between families. The exact customs varied across medieval Europe, but the central idea was often the same, a public commitment that pointed toward an upcoming wedding. This period between betrothal and marriage could last for some time. In some cases, it was only a few weeks. In others, it lasted months or even longer, especially if a household needed to be prepared or economic conditions were uncertain. During this time, the couple occupied an interesting position within the community. They were not yet husband and wife. But they were no longer simply two unrelated young people. Neighbors treated them differently. Families expected them to continue preparing for married life. The future household had begun to take shape in everyone's imagination. This is an important part of understanding how people lost their virginity in medieval Europe. For many ordinary couples, the first sexual experience was not an isolated event that occurred suddenly and without context. It usually came at the end of a long social process, growing up, gaining skills, earning a good reputation, being observed by the community, receiving family approval, and making a public promise of marriage. As evening approaches, candles are lit inside the cottages. The village grows quiet once more, waiting for the wedding. The promise has now been spoken. The witnesses have heard it, the families have accepted it, and the village has quietly folded the news into its memory. In medieval Europe, this was often the moment when the future began to feel real. The wedding might still be weeks or months away, but the path toward it had become visible, and everyone around you understood that a new household was slowly coming into being. The morning air is colder now. Autumn has deepened, and the leaves along the village lane have turned shades of amber, brown, and faded gold. Smoke rises steadily from the cottages, and the fields, once busy with harvest, now rest beneath a pale sky. The rhythm of life has changed. There is less work outdoors and more work inside the home, mending clothes, repairing tools, preserving food, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and preparing for winter. You wake before sunrise, as medieval people usually did, and step outside into the stillness of dawn. Frost sparkles on the grass. A horse breathes clouds of white vapor into the air. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell rings softly, marking the hour of morning prayer. You are no longer simply a young person of the village. You are someone who is promised in marriage. The difference is subtle, yet everyone seems to notice it. An older neighbor greets you with a warmer smile. A child asks whether there will be dancing at your wedding feast. A visiting merchant offers congratulations after hearing the news from someone you have never met before. Information travels slowly across medieval Europe, but within a village it travels remarkably well. This period between betrothal and marriage was often one of quiet preparation. Contrary to many modern stories, medieval weddings did not always happen immediately after an engagement. A household had to be prepared. Clothing had to be made or repaired. Food had to be stored. Livestock, tools, furniture, and household goods needed to be gathered. Families often worked together to ensure that the couple would have what they needed to begin their life together. As the sun rises, imagine helping your family repair a small wooden chest. The chest will eventually hold linens, clothing, blankets, and other useful possessions. A mother carefully folds woven cloth that has taken months to produce. A father checks the condition of farming tools. An older relative quietly explains how much flour should be stored for winter and how carefully grain must be protected from dampness and mice. Marriage, in medieval Europe, was deeply practical. A husband and wife would need more than affection. They would need bread, firewood, clothing, shelter, and the ability to work together through every season of the year. The preparations before the wedding were therefore also preparations for survival. As afternoon light filters through the small windows of a cottage, an older woman sits beside the fire spinning wool. She speaks gently about marriage. Not about grand romance, but about patience. She explains that a household is built from ordinary habits, rising early, sharing work, speaking kindly during difficult days, and caring for one another when illness comes. She remembers her own wedding many years earlier and smiles quietly. "We were both frightened," she says. "Not because we did not trust each other, but because we had never carried such responsibility before." This simple memory reflects something historians often emphasize. Many medieval couples were quite young and had limited private experience together before marriage. Courtship usually took place within a community that observed them closely. Families, neighbors, and the church all played important roles in shaping expectations. The wedding night, which we will explore later in this series, was often approached with uncertainty as well as hope. During the waiting period, couples were generally expected to behave with restraint. Church teaching encouraged chastity before marriage, and many communities expected an engaged couple to avoid behavior that might damage their reputation. Historical records show that these ideals were not always perfectly followed. Church courts contain cases involving premarital relationships, broken promises, and disputes about whether a couple had already become husband and wife through private vows. Medieval people were human, and their lives were often more complicated than religious ideals suggested. Yet for many ordinary villagers, the expectation remained clear: the first sexual experience should ideally occur after the wedding, when the marriage had been publicly recognized and blessed. As evening approaches, the village prepares for another gathering. This time it is not a festival, but a communal work evening. Neighbors gather in a large cottage to spin wool, mend clothing, and share stories while the wind blows outside. Candles flicker against the timber walls, and the room is filled with the gentle sounds of spinning wheels and quiet conversation. Someone begins an old song. Another person tells a story about a couple who married during a harsh winter and survived because the village helped them through their first difficult season. These stories matter. They teach that marriage is not only the union of two people, but the creation of a household that the community hopes will endure. Imagine walking home beneath a clear night sky. The stars seem brighter now that the air has grown colder. The path between the cottages is familiar, yet it feels different because the future has begun to take shape in your mind. You think about the small house that may one day be yours. You think about shared meals, shared work, and the possibility of children who will someday walk these same paths. For many ordinary people in medieval Europe, losing virginity was understood within exactly this framework. It was not usually imagined as a dramatic adventure, a scandalous secret, or a personal achievement. It was the moment when a marriage was completed and a household truly began. The first sexual experience was therefore connected to vows, community recognition, family responsibility, and the hope of future generations. As winter draws closer, preparations continue. A simple wool garment is carefully sewn. A pair of shoes is repaired. A wooden bed frame is strengthened. Blankets are aired and folded. Bread is baked and dried for storage. Every small task becomes part of the larger journey toward marriage. The village priest visits one afternoon. He speaks quietly with the couple about faithfulness, mutual respect, and the responsibilities that marriage brings. He reminds them that husband and wife are expected to support one another through prosperity and hardship alike. His words are gentle rather than severe, and they reflect the medieval understanding that marriage is both a social bond and a sacred commitment. Outside, the first snow begins to fall. It settles softly on rooftops, fences, and bare branches, covering the village in a peaceful silence. Children laugh as they leave footprints in the fresh snow, while older villagers watch from doorways wrapped in wool cloaks. The waiting has become part of the story. Day after day, the couple continues working, praying, preparing, and learning. They are becoming ready not only for a ceremony, but for a lifetime of shared responsibilities. Their families are becoming connected. Their neighbors are becoming witnesses. Their future household is slowly gathering its first possessions. The night grows deeper. The fire burns low. The church bell sounds across the snowy fields, and the village settles into stillness. You now stand at the threshold between promise and marriage, between preparation and fulfillment. The path that began with childhood, work, reputation, and courtship has led you here, to the quiet season of waiting that so many medieval Europeans experience before the wedding itself. The wedding day. The ceremony. The morning of the wedding begins before the sun has fully risen. A pale blue light rests over the fields, and the village seems to be holding its breath. Smoke rises from chimneys in thin, quiet columns, and the church bell rings softly across the countryside, not yet calling everyone to worship, but reminding the community that this day is different from the ordinary days that came before it. In medieval Europe, weddings were not simply private celebrations between two people. They were public events that involved families, neighbors, the parish, and the wider community. The marriage of one couple was understood as the creation of a new household, and the village often treated that beginning as something worthy of witness. Imagine yourself standing outside a modest timber and thatch cottage. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and freshly baked bread. Inside, relatives are already awake. Wool garments are being brushed, cloaks are being fastened, shoes are being repaired one last time, and simple ribbons or small pieces of jewelry are being carefully arranged. Most ordinary medieval Europeans did not wear elaborate white wedding dresses. The famous white bridal gown became common much later in history. A village bride would more likely wear her best dress, perhaps newly made if the family could afford it, or perhaps carefully preserved from another important occasion. A groom would wear his best tunic, cloak, belt, and shoes, all chosen to show dignity and respect rather than great wealth. The mood inside the house is not one of loud excitement. It is quieter than that. There is nervousness. There is anticipation. There is a sense that childhood has finally given way to something else. An older woman adjusts the bride's veil or head covering and speaks softly about patience, kindness, and the ordinary work of marriage. Another relative folds a cloak around the groom's shoulders and reminds him to be steady, respectful, and faithful. Much of medieval wisdom was passed through these gentle conversations rather than through formal instruction. Outside, neighbors begin gathering along the lane. Children watch curiously from doorways. Elderly villagers, who have seen many weddings over the years, smile with quiet understanding. They remember their own wedding mornings, their own uncertainty, and the long lives that followed those first solemn promises. The walk to the church is short. The church stands at the center of the village, built of stone that has weathered generations of rain, snow, and wind. Its walls are cool, its windows small, and its bell tower rises above the surrounding cottages and fields. For medieval people, the church was not only a place of worship, it was the place where births, marriages, deaths, and the passage of time itself were marked. One of the most surprising things about many medieval weddings is that an important part of the ceremony often took place outside the church, near the church door. This custom varied across regions and centuries, but in much of medieval Europe, the exchange of consent, the moment when the couple declared that they took one another as husband and wife, could occur before entering the church building. The community gathered nearby because marriage was understood as a public act that affected families, property, inheritance, and social relationships. The priest arrives wearing simple vestments. He greets the couple and asks whether they come freely and willingly. Medieval canon law placed great importance on consent. Although families often influence marriages strongly, the church increasingly emphasized that a valid marriage required the willing agreement of both bride and groom. This principle became one of the most distinctive features of medieval Christian marriage. Imagine the couple standing together before the church door. The village has fallen almost completely silent. The priest asks the questions that have been asked in countless villages across medieval Europe. Do you take this person as your husband? Do you take this person as your wife? The answers are spoken clearly. Hands may be joined. Rings may be exchanged, though the exact customs differed from place to place. In some regions, a ring was placed on the bride's finger as a symbol of the marriage bond. In others, additional gifts or tokens were exchanged between families. What matters most is the spoken promise. Words carried enormous power in medieval society. In a world where many ordinary people could not read or write, spoken vows were not casual expressions. They were binding commitments witnessed by neighbors, relatives, and the church. A promise made publicly was expected to be remembered publicly. After the vows, the couple enters the church. The interior is dim and cool. Candles flicker before painted saints. The smell of beeswax and incense fills the air. Sunlight filters through narrow windows, falling across worn stone floors that have supported generations of worshippers. The priest offers prayers for the couple, asking for blessing, faithfulness, peace, and children if it is God's will. This is an important moment in understanding how people lost their virginity in medieval Europe. The wedding ceremony itself was not merely a celebration of romantic love. It marked the beginning of a socially recognized and religiously sanctioned union. For many ordinary people, the expectation was that sexual relations would begin after this ceremony, not before it. Virginity was therefore closely connected to the wedding day because the wedding created the framework within which sexual intimacy was considered honorable and legitimate. As the prayers continue, imagine the couple kneeling together. They are surrounded by familiar faces. Parents who raised them. Neighbors who watched them grow. Children who will someday remember this day. The village is witnessing not only a ceremony but the formation of a new household that may endure for decades. Historians often remind us that medieval marriage was practical as well as emotional. A husband and wife would share labor, food, shelter, responsibilities, and eventually, in many cases, the raising of children. The wedding therefore marked the beginning of economic cooperation, mutual support, and participation in the wider network of family obligations that held medieval communities together. When the ceremony ends, the church bell begins to ring. Its sound spreads across the fields and forests, announcing that a marriage has taken place. The villagers emerge into the daylight together. Congratulations are offered. Blessings are spoken. Some people embrace the couple, others simply nod with quiet satisfaction. The atmosphere has changed. The nervous anticipation of the morning has become gentle relief. The bride and groom are no longer merely promised to one another. They are now husband and wife. As the procession leaves the church, children scatter flower petals or greenery along the path in some regions, while musicians begin playing simple tunes on pipes, fiddles, or other local instruments where such customs existed. The walk back through the village is slower than the walk to the church. People stop to greet the couple, and the entire community seems to move together toward the place where the wedding feast will soon begin. The sun has now risen high enough to warm the fields. The frost has disappeared. The village looks peaceful beneath the clear sky. This day, which began with quiet preparation, has now reached its central moment. The vows have been spoken, the blessing has been given, and the marriage has been publicly recognized. For countless ordinary people across medieval Europe, this ceremony marked the threshold before the first night of marriage. Their virginity had not yet been lost, but the path toward that moment had been carefully prepared through years of work, family guidance, courtship, public promises, and finally the wedding itself. The bells continue to ring across the countryside. Neighbors walk together through the lanes. Bread is being carried toward long wooden tables. Ale is being poured into waiting cups. The feast is about to begin, and with it the next stage of the journey that led so many medieval Europeans from youth into marriage, household life, and eventually the intimate beginning of their shared future. The feast, the blessings, and the journey home. The church bells continue to ring long after the ceremony has ended. Their sound travels across the harvested fields, through the bare branches of late autumn trees, and along the narrow paths that connect the cottages of the village. For the people of medieval Europe, bells were more than music. They marked births, deaths, holy days, harvests, storms, and weddings. Today, they announce that a new household has begun. Imagine yourself walking with the wedding procession as it leaves the churchyard. The bride and groom walk side by side, still carrying the quiet solemnity of the vows they have just spoken. Around them are parents, brothers, sisters, neighbors, godparents, childhood friends, and elderly villagers who have witnessed many weddings across many years. Children run ahead along the path, laughing as they chase one another between the hedges. A fiddler begins playing a gentle melody, and someone joins with a small pipe or simple drum. The music is not grand, but it is warm, familiar, and deeply woven into the life of the community. The path leads back toward the village green, where long wooden tables have been arranged outside a large barn and several neighboring cottages. The feast will not resemble the extravagant banquets of kings and queens that often appear in films. Most ordinary medieval Europeans lived modestly, and their celebrations reflected that reality. Yet modest did not mean joyless. A wedding feast was often one of the most important communal gatherings a village could experience. Bread has been baked since before dawn. Large round loaves rest on woven baskets lined with clean cloth. Cheese made from cows' or sheep's milk has been carefully aged for the occasion. Stews of barley, beans, onions, and herbs simmer over open fires. If the family is prosperous enough, roasted pork, mutton, goose, or chicken may be served. Ale has been brewed in advance, and wooden cups are passed from hand to hand. Honey cakes, dried apples, nuts, and preserved fruits appear as special treats. The entire village seems to have contributed something. One neighbor brought extra firewood. Another lent benches. A third helped slaughter and prepare an animal. A fourth spent days weaving a tablecloth or sewing a garment. This is one of the beautiful realities of medieval village life. A wedding was often a community effort. The new couple was not expected to begin their life entirely alone. The people around them helped create the conditions in which a household could survive. As everyone takes their places, the priest offers a blessing over the food. Heads are bowed. The prayer is simple, asking for gratitude, peace, fertility of the fields, and blessing upon the newly married couple. Medieval Europe was deeply shaped by religious belief, and even ordinary meals were often connected to prayer and thanksgiving. The feast begins slowly. People eat, drink, and talk in the unhurried way that belongs to communities where everyone already knows one another. Elderly women exchange stories about weddings from decades earlier. Farmers discuss the coming winter. Children wander between the tables carrying crusts of bread and pieces of fruit. The bride's mother notices that the groom has quietly refilled an older relative's cup, and she smiles to herself. The groom's father observes the bride speaking gently to a frightened child, and he nods with quiet approval. These small observations mattered. Marriage was not judged only by the ceremony. It was judged by character, patience, generosity, and the ability to become part of another family. The feast allowed everyone to witness those qualities in ordinary moments. As the afternoon light softens, music grows livelier. A circle dance begins. Young and old join together, stepping in patterns that have been repeated for generations. The bride and groom dance first, but soon they are surrounded by neighbors, cousins, and friends. Laughter rises into the cool air. For a little while, the worries of taxes, harvests, illness, and hard winters seem far away. Historians often remind us that medieval life was physically demanding and economically uncertain. A wedding feast was therefore not only a celebration of love, it was also a celebration of survival, continuity, and hope. The village was rejoicing because another household would continue the work of the community, cultivate fields, raise children, care for elders, and carry traditions into the future. As the sun begins to descend, gifts are presented. Do not imagine piles of expensive packages wrapped in bright paper. Medieval gifts were usually practical. A blanket woven by an aunt. A wooden chest made by a neighbor. A cooking pot. A set of bowls. A stool. A pair of candlesticks. A sack of grain. A young goat or a few chickens. A length of linen cloth. These were gifts that helped build a household, and each one carried the quiet message, "May your home endure." An elderly woman approaches the bride with a folded linen cloth. "I received this when I married," she says softly. "Now it is your turn." A carpenter places a small wooden cradle near the wall of the barn. "It may be useful someday," he says with a gentle smile. No one speaks directly about the intimate future of the couple. That is not the custom. Instead, people speak about bread, blankets, roofs, gardens, livestock, and children in the future tense. In medieval Europe, these were the language of marriage itself. As evening approaches, the atmosphere changes again. The feast has been joyful, but now a quieter mood begins to settle over the gathering. Candles are lit inside the cottages. Torches are prepared for the walk home. The music becomes slower. The older generation watches the young couple with a mixture of happiness and tenderness, remembering that this day marks not only celebration but also departure. The bride is leaving one household to become part of another. The groom is accepting responsibility for a shared future. This transition was emotionally significant in many medieval communities. A wedding could mean moving into a new home, joining a different family network, and beginning the practical realities of married life almost immediately. Imagine walking with the procession as darkness gathers. The stars appear above the village one by one. The air has grown colder, and cloaks are drawn tightly around shoulders. The bride and groom walk toward the small house where they will spend their first night as husband and wife. Sometimes it is a separate cottage prepared for them. Sometimes it is a room within a family household. Living arrangements varied enormously across medieval Europe, and many newly married couples began life in very modest circumstances. Neighbors accompany them part of the way. Some sing quietly. Others carry lanterns. An older relative offers one final piece of advice. Be patient with one another. Another says, a good marriage is built day by day. These simple words contain much of medieval wisdom. For ordinary people, the wedding night was important, but it was not expected to sustain a marriage by itself. What sustained a marriage was cooperation through thousands of ordinary days, baking bread, mending clothes, tending animals, planting crops, caring for children, comforting one another during illness, and facing winter together. In some regions of medieval Europe, there were customs surrounding the escorting of the couple to their chamber, though practices varied widely by place and century. Friends or relatives might accompany them with songs, blessings, or playful good wishes before leaving them in privacy. Historians are cautious about generalizing these customs because medieval Europe was remarkably diverse, but what remains consistent is that the community understood this night as the beginning of married life. The door closes. The voices outside gradually fade. The couple is finally alone. This is the threshold toward which the entire story has been moving. Childhood, work, reputation, courtship, family approval, betrothal, preparation, and the wedding ceremony have all led to this quiet moment. For many ordinary medieval Europeans, virginity was expected to be lost only after the marriage had been publicly recognized and blessed. The significance of the night lay not in spectacle or romance alone, but in the belief that a new household had truly begun. Outside, the village grows still. The torches burn lower. The last guests return to their homes. The church bell sounds once more across the dark fields, and its echo lingers in the cold night air. Inside the small house, a fire glows softly in the hearth. A wooden bed stands against the wall, covered with blankets and simple linen. The room is humble, but it belongs to the future. Tomorrow there will be bread to bake, water to carry, animals to feed, and work to begin together. The first night of marriage is therefore not an ending, it is the opening of a life that may stretch across decades. The stars shine above the silent village. Smoke drifts gently from the chimneys. The fields rest beneath the moonlight. And somewhere within that quiet landscape, another ordinary medieval household has begun its long journey through the seasons of life, just as countless others did across the villages and towns of medieval Europe. How most people lost their virginity. The wedding night. The village is finally quiet. The music has faded into the distance, the last guests have returned to their homes, and the torches that lit the wedding procession have burned low. A gentle wind moves across the fields, carrying the scent of damp earth, smoke, and harvested grain. The church bell has marked the evening hour, and beneath the wide medieval sky, a new household has begun. Imagine yourself standing outside a small timber and thatch cottage somewhere in medieval Europe during the late Middle Ages. The celebration has ended. Bread has been eaten, ale has been shared, blessings have been spoken, and neighbors have offered their good wishes. The day that began with solemn vows before the church has now arrived at the moment that many medieval people quietly understood to be the beginning of married life. This is where we must be careful, because the medieval wedding night has often been surrounded by myths. Modern stories sometimes imagine it as a dramatic, theatrical, or even frightening event. The historical reality was usually much more ordinary. For most peasants, craftsmen, servants, and townspeople, the wedding night took place in a modest room with simple furniture, a wooden bed, linen sheets if the family was fortunate, wool blankets, and perhaps a small fire in the hearth if fuel was available. The room was often not luxurious. It was practical. A chest for clothing, a stool, a table, a few cooking vessels, a candle, perhaps a small religious image or wooden cross hanging on the wall. The new husband and wife entered this room not as strangers in a romantic tale, but as two people who had already traveled a long road together through childhood, work, courtship, family approval, betrothal, and the wedding ceremony itself. The door closes quietly behind them. Outside, a few neighbors may still be speaking in low voices before returning home. In some regions of medieval Europe, friends or relatives accompanied the couple to their chamber with songs, blessings, or playful jokes. In other places, the transition was much simpler. Customs varied widely across centuries and regions, and historians are cautious about treating any single tradition as universal. What remained remarkably consistent was the expectation that the marriage would now begin in full. For many ordinary medieval Europeans, virginity was not primarily understood as a private personal milestone. It was understood as part of the transition into marriage. The first sexual experience was expected to occur after the wedding because marriage had created a socially recognized household. The Church regarded sexual relations within marriage as legitimate and honorable, and medieval communities generally connected the beginning of sexual life with the beginning of married life. The young couple is often nervous. This is one of the historical realities that is easy to overlook. Most ordinary people received little formal education about sexuality. Medical texts existed, and clergy discussed marriage and morality, but many villagers learned about married life through observation, conversation, and the quiet advice of older relatives. Mothers, aunts, grandmothers, and experienced married women often prepared brides with practical guidance. Fathers, uncles, older brothers, and respected men in the community sometimes did the same for grooms. Even so, uncertainty was common. Imagine the candlelight flickering across the wooden walls. The sounds of the village grow fainter. The husband and wife sit together for a while without speaking very much. They have known one another for months or years. They have worked in neighboring fields, spoken after church, walked home from festivals, and exchanged promises before witnesses. Yet this moment is still new. They are no longer merely promised to one another. They are husband and wife. An older woman's advice echoes in the bride's memory: be patient. An older man's words remain with the groom: a household is built day by day. These simple pieces of wisdom reveal something important about medieval attitudes. The wedding night mattered, but it was not expected to carry the entire weight of the marriage. What mattered even more was what would happen afterward: the shared labor, shared meals, shared winters, shared illnesses, shared harvests, and shared responsibilities that would fill the years ahead. Historians who study medieval marriage emphasize that consummation had legal and religious significance. A marriage that had been publicly celebrated and then consummated was generally regarded as fully established. This mattered in questions of inheritance, legitimacy, and certain legal disputes. Medieval canon law developed complex ideas about consent, marriage, and consummation, and church courts occasionally heard cases involving whether a marriage had been completed. Yet these legal discussions should not obscure the human reality. For most ordinary couples, the wedding night was simply the first evening of living together. The room is quiet now. The fire burns softly. Outside, frost begins forming on the grass. Inside, two young people are beginning the ordinary life that countless generations before them had also begun. There is often tenderness mixed with uncertainty. There may be awkwardness. There may be conversation. There may be silence. There may be relief that the long day of ceremony and celebration has finally ended. Modern films frequently present the wedding night as a moment of perfect confidence or overwhelming passion. Medieval evidence suggests something much simpler. Many couples were tired. Weddings involved long ceremonies, feasting, social obligations, and interaction with large numbers of relatives and neighbors. By evening, physical exhaustion was often as real as emotional anticipation. The first night of marriage therefore belonged not only to intimacy, but also to companionship. Imagine the husband adding another piece of wood to the fire. The wife folds a cloak and places it near the bed. They speak about tomorrow. There will be water to carry, animals to feed, bread to bake, perhaps fields to tend or a workshop to open. Married life begins immediately. This practical quality is one of the most striking aspects of medieval Europe. The transition from virginity to sexual life was rarely separated from the transition into economic cooperation. Husband and wife became partners in labor as well as in affection. Their household would depend on both of them, and survival often required constant collaboration. The candle burns lower. The village is asleep. Only the distant sound of an owl breaks the silence. For many medieval Europeans, this night was remembered not because it resembled a dramatic legend, but because it marked the moment when they ceased to be simply sons and daughters within their parents' households and became the founders of a household of their own. In later years, an old couple might remember this evening with surprising gentleness. They might remember the small room, the cold outside, the sound of the wind, the nervousness they both felt, the kindness they showed one another, the realization that tomorrow they would wake as husband and wife and begin a life that would stretch through seasons of planting and harvest, through births and funerals, through prosperity and hardship, through youth and eventually old age. The wedding night was therefore less an isolated event than a threshold. Everything before it, childhood, work, reputation, courtship, family approval, betrothal, and the wedding ceremony had led toward this quiet beginning. Everything after it would become the long story of marriage itself. The fire settles into glowing embers. The candle finally goes out. The fields lie silent beneath the moon. And somewhere within the sleeping village, another ordinary medieval couple begins the first peaceful night of a shared life that may last for decades, carrying forward the same quiet pattern by which countless people across medieval Europe entered marriage and, within that marriage, began their intimate lives together. The first night together. The night has grown deeper now. The last voices outside the cottage have faded, and the village has settled into the quiet that belongs only to the countryside after a day of celebration. The stars stretch across the dark sky above the fields, and a pale moon rests over the rooftops of timber and thatch. Inside the small house, the fire has burned lower, leaving a gentle warmth that pushes back the chill of the late autumn air. This is the moment that medieval people often understood not as the end of the wedding, but as the true beginning of married life. Imagine yourself sitting beside the hearth with the person who has, only a few hours earlier, become your husband or your wife. The long ceremony, the blessings, the feast, the dancing, and the endless greetings from relatives and neighbors are all behind you now. For the first time that day, there is silence. It is a surprisingly ordinary silence. For many modern people, the wedding night is imagined as a dramatic turning point filled with certainty and passion. Medieval Europe was often much less theatrical than that. Most ordinary couples entered marriage with a mixture of hope, nervousness, curiosity, and simple exhaustion. They had spent the entire day surrounded by family and community. They had been observed, blessed, congratulated, and celebrated. Now they were finally alone. The room around them was usually modest. A wooden bed stood against one wall, often filled with straw or feathers if the household was fortunate. A chest held clothing and household linens. A stool, a table, a few clay or wooden vessels, and perhaps a candle or small oil lamp completed the furnishings. The house was not a place of luxury. It was a place where tomorrow's bread would be baked, tomorrow's water carried, and tomorrow's work planned. This simplicity is important. For most ordinary medieval Europeans, the first sexual experience did not take place in an atmosphere of great wealth or elaborate ceremony. It took place in the same kind of room where they would spend countless ordinary evenings over the years that followed. The wedding night was not separated from everyday life, it was woven directly into it. The husband adds another piece of wood to the fire. The wife folds a cloak and places it near the bed. They speak quietly, perhaps about the feast, perhaps about a relative who traveled a long distance to attend, perhaps about the weather that will greet them in the morning. Medieval sources rarely preserve conversations from wedding nights, but they preserve enough evidence to suggest that companionship was an important part of marriage. A household could not function without cooperation, and cooperation usually began with conversation. In many parts of medieval Europe, young people knew one another before marriage. They had met through work, church, markets, harvest gatherings, and village life. They were not always strangers brought together suddenly. They had often spent months or years observing each other's character. They knew how the other person worked, spoke, laughed, and behaved among neighbors. This familiarity mattered. The first night together was usually not the first time they had ever spoken privately, but it was often the first time they were expected to begin life as husband and wife in every sense recognized by their community. Historians who study medieval marriage records frequently emphasize that consummation had both symbolic and practical significance. A marriage publicly celebrated and then consummated was generally regarded as fully established. This could matter in questions of inheritance, legitimacy, property, and certain legal disputes. Church courts sometimes heard cases involving whether a marriage had truly been completed, which reminds us that medieval people took the matter seriously. Yet the legal importance should not overshadow the human experience. Imagine the couple sitting quietly for a long time. Outside, the wind moves through the trees. The church bell sounds faintly in the distance. Inside, two people who have spent years preparing for adulthood are beginning to understand that the preparation has ended. For many ordinary medieval Europeans, losing virginity was less about a dramatic physical event and more about crossing a social and emotional threshold. They had moved from the household of their parents into a household of their own. They had become responsible for one another. They had entered a partnership expected to endure through seasons of plenty and seasons of hardship alike. Older relatives often understood this better than the young couple themselves. A grandmother who had been married for 40 years might remember her own wedding night with surprising gentleness. She might not remember every detail of the ceremony, but she would remember the small room, the cold outside, the smell of smoke from the hearth, and the realization that tomorrow she would wake not as a daughter, but as a wife. This perspective appears again and again in historical writing about ordinary medieval life. Marriage was not primarily celebrated because of a single night. It was celebrated because of the lifetime that was expected to follow. The first sexual experience therefore gained its meaning from everything around it: the vows, the blessing, the household, the community, and the hope of future generations. As the fire settles into glowing embers, imagine the couple speaking about practical matters. Where will the grain be stored? Which field belongs to them? How many chickens were given as wedding gifts? When should they visit the bride's parents? These questions may seem unromantic to modern ears, yet they reveal the reality of medieval marriage. Economic cooperation began immediately. A husband and wife needed to plan, organize, and work together from the very first days of their union. This practical beginning did not exclude affection. On the contrary, many historians argue that affection often grew through shared labor. Planting crops together, repairing a roof together, caring for children together, surviving illness together, and enduring difficult winters together could create deep emotional bonds. Medieval love was not always expressed in elaborate speeches, it was often expressed through reliability, protection, generosity, and daily cooperation. The candle burns lower. The room grows darker. The village remains silent. For many couples, the first night together was accompanied by uncertainty. Neither partner was expected to possess complete knowledge. Information about the body and marriage was unevenly distributed, and many young people learned gradually through experience and the quiet guidance of older relatives. This is one reason historians caution against imagining medieval people as either completely ignorant or fully informed. The reality lay somewhere between those extremes. What seems most consistent across surviving evidence is that the first night was understood as the beginning of a relationship rather than the completion of a romance. The marriage had been formed publicly. Now it would be lived privately. Tomorrow morning, the couple would rise early. Water would still need to be carried from the well. Animals would still need feeding. Bread would still need baking. The fields, the workshop, the market, and the changing seasons would continue exactly as before. Yet everything would also be different. They would now perform those tasks together. As midnight passes, the fire becomes a bed of quiet red embers. The moonlight enters through a small window and falls across the wooden floor. The modest room feels peaceful rather than grand, and that peace may be the most historically accurate image of all. For countless ordinary people across medieval Europe, losing their virginity happened within a marriage that had been patiently prepared by years of work, family guidance, courtship, betrothal, and public vows. It was usually not an act of rebellion or adventure. It was an act woven into the creation of a household and the beginning of adult responsibility. The couple eventually lies down to rest. Outside, frost forms across the fields. Inside, the warmth of the hearth slowly fades. When dawn arrives, they will wake as husband and wife, and the ordinary work of married life will begin. The first night will already be becoming a memory, while the much longer story of partnership, labor, family, and the passing of years stretches quietly ahead of them. The church bell will ring again. Neighbors will greet them differently. The village will recognize them as a new household. And in that quiet recognition lies the deeper historical truth. For most ordinary medieval Europeans, the loss of virginity was inseparable from the beginning of a shared life, a shared home, and a shared future that would be measured not in moments, but in harvests, winters, and generations. The days after. Becoming husband and wife. The morning after the wedding arrives quietly. The celebration has ended, the guests have returned to their homes, and the village has resumed its familiar rhythm. The church bell rings at dawn just as it did yesterday and just as it will tomorrow. Smoke rises from the chimneys, roosters call across the fields, and the narrow paths between the cottages begin to fill with people carrying buckets, tools, and baskets. Medieval Europe rarely paused for long, even after a wedding. Life continued, and that continuation was itself one of the most important parts of marriage. Imagine opening the door of a small timber and thatch house somewhere in medieval Europe during the late Middle Ages. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. A few neighbors glance toward the cottage and smile as you step outside. Their greeting is almost the same as it was before the wedding, yet something has changed. Yesterday you were known as a son or daughter of one household. Today you are known as part of a household of your own. This quiet change in identity mattered enormously in medieval society. For many ordinary people, the first night of marriage was significant because it marked the beginning of a new social role. The community now regarded the couple as husband and wife, and that recognition shaped everything that followed. They would be expected to work together, make decisions together, manage resources together, and eventually, in many cases, raise children together. The transition from virginity to married life was therefore not confined to a single evening. It continued into the next morning, the next week, and the next season. The husband lifts a wooden bucket and walks toward the well. The wife begins preparing bread from flour stored in a small chest. These tasks are simple, yet they reveal the deeper reality of medieval marriage. A household was an economic partnership. Every loaf of bread, every bundle of firewood, every repaired tool, every planted field, and every carefully preserved vegetable contributed to survival. Love might have brought two people together, but cooperation kept them alive. Historians often emphasize that marriage in medieval Europe was practical in ways that modern people sometimes underestimate. A married couple shared labor from the very beginning. They did not usually spend weeks in leisure after the wedding. The demands of farming, animal care, craft production, trade, or domestic work resumed almost immediately. As the sun rises over the fields, imagine walking through the village together. An elderly woman offers congratulations once more. A farmer asks whether help will be needed with repairing a fence. A child points and whispers, "They were married yesterday." The village has accepted the new household into its familiar pattern. This communal recognition is one of the reasons that the loss of virginity carried such social meaning. It was not merely a private event hidden from the world. It was understood as part of a publicly acknowledged transition into adulthood, responsibility, and household formation. In many parts of medieval Europe, neighbors paid attention to whether a marriage seemed harmonious. A couple that worked well together, treated one another with respect, and contributed to village life earned a valuable reputation. That reputation could influence future relationships, business dealings, and family alliances. The morning grows warmer. The wife kneads dough on a wooden table while the husband repairs a loose hinge on the door. They speak quietly about the tasks that must be completed before winter. Grain must be protected from moisture. Firewood must be gathered. A small roof leak should be repaired before heavy rains arrive. These conversations may seem ordinary, yet they are the foundation of married life. This is another important historical truth. For many medieval Europeans, the meaning of the first sexual experience became intertwined with the work that followed it. Consummation was important, but it was only the opening of a much longer story. The true measure of a marriage was found in years of shared labor, shared meals, shared hardships, and shared hopes. As afternoon light fills the cottage, an older relative arrives carrying a small gift, a bundle of linen cloth and a few dried herbs. She sits beside the fire and offers gentle advice. "Do not try to become perfect in a single day," she says. "A good marriage is learned slowly." Her words reflect the experience of countless medieval women who understood that newly married couples often needed time to adjust. The husband and wife were learning each other's habits, rhythms, strengths, and weaknesses. They were discovering how to divide work, resolve disagreements, and make decisions together. Many modern stories focus intensely on the wedding night, but medieval life suggests a broader perspective. The days immediately afterward were often just as important. They were the days when the couple began practicing the partnership that would sustain them through decades of ordinary existence. Outside, neighbors gather to help stack firewood for the coming winter. One man lends an axe. Another brings a cart. A woman offers extra onions from her garden. This reminds us that medieval households rarely existed in complete isolation. They were embedded in networks of family and community support. Weddings strengthened those networks, and newly married couples often benefited from the goodwill of relatives and neighbors who wanted the household to succeed. As evening approaches, the couple shares a simple meal: bread, cheese, pottage, and ale. The excitement of the wedding has faded into a quieter companionship. They know that tomorrow will bring more work, and the day after that, and the day after that. Yet there is comfort in the routine. Medieval life was filled with uncertainty, poor harvests, illness, harsh winters, and changing fortunes, but routine offered stability. The church bell rings for evening prayers. The couple walks together toward the church. Inside, candles flicker before painted saints, and familiar prayers fill the cool stone building. They stand beside one another as husband and wife for the first time during an ordinary service rather than a wedding ceremony. The difference feels subtle, almost invisible, yet deeply real. They belong together now in the eyes of the community. They return home beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. The village is quiet once more. A dog barks in the distance. The smell of smoke drifts gently through the cold air. Inside the cottage, the fire burns softly as they prepare for another night of rest. For many ordinary people across medieval Europe, this was how married life truly began. Not with endless celebration, but with the peaceful return of ordinary days. The loss of virginity had marked a threshold, but the greater journey was only beginning. They had become husband and wife not only in name, but in the daily practice of living, working, praying, and facing the seasons together. The stars shine above the dark fields. The fire settles into glowing embers. Tomorrow the same church bell will ring again, and another day of shared life will begin. And in that quiet repetition, morning after morning, season after season, countless medieval couples discovered that marriage was not built from a single night, but from thousands of ordinary moments gently woven together across the years. The days after. Learning together. Several weeks have now passed since the wedding. The excitement that once filled the village has settled into memory, and the new household has become part of the ordinary rhythm of medieval life. The church bells ring at dawn as they always have, smoke rises from the chimneys, and the fields stretch quietly beneath the changing sky. If a traveler were to pass through the village today, they might not know that a marriage had recently taken place. Yet the people who live here know. They see it in small things: two figures walking together toward the well, two pairs of hands working in the same field, two voices discussing the winter stores beside a glowing hearth. This is where the deeper story begins. For many ordinary people in medieval Europe, the wedding night was important, but it was not the whole story of losing one's virginity. The first sexual experience was understood as the beginning of married life, not its climax. What mattered even more was what followed: the gradual learning of another person, the sharing of work, the discovery of habits, and the quiet transformation from two individuals into one household. Imagine waking before sunrise. The room is still dark except for the faint glow of embers left from the night before. Outside, frost has formed on the ground, and the air is cold enough that each breath becomes visible. The husband rises first to check the animals. The wife begins preparing the morning meal from flour, oats, and a small store of dried herbs. Neither task is dramatic, yet both are essential. This is how medieval marriage often revealed itself. Not through grand speeches, but through ordinary cooperation. The husband returns carrying a bundle of firewood. The wife has already placed water over the fire. They exchange a few quiet words about the day ahead. One must repair a fence damaged by recent rain. The other must spin wool and help a neighboring family preserve apples before the first heavy frost. Historians who study medieval households repeatedly encounter this pattern: husband and wife working side by side in ways that were different but deeply interconnected. A medieval household was a small economic unit. Food had to be produced, clothing made or repaired, tools maintained, animals cared for, and supplies prepared for winter. Marriage was therefore a partnership of labor as much as affection. As the sun rises, the village begins to stir. Children chase geese away from gardens. An elderly man sharpens a scythe. A woman carries a basket of vegetables toward the market road. Neighbors greet the newly married couple with the easy familiarity that comes when celebration has passed and everyday life has returned. One neighbor asks, "How is the roof holding after the last storm?" Another says, "We have extra onions if you need them." These small exchanges remind us that medieval households rarely existed in isolation. Families depended on one another, borrowed tools, shared labor during harvest, helped repair buildings, and cared for neighbors during illness. A successful marriage was often supported by a successful community. As the morning continues, imagine working together in a small field. The soil is damp, and the autumn light is soft. One person gathers stones from the earth while the other prepares rows for planting winter crops. Conversation comes and goes naturally. Sometimes there is silence. Sometimes there is discussion about weather, grain stores, or the coming feast day. Medieval couples spent enormous amounts of time together while working, and that shared labor often became the place where trust and companionship deepened. This is another important truth about how people lost their virginity in medieval Europe. The first sexual experience was rarely separated from the rest of married life. It was not treated as an isolated achievement or a story to be told repeatedly. It became one thread in a much larger fabric of daily existence. The memory of the wedding night soon stood beside memories of repairing a roof together, surviving a difficult winter together, caring for a sick relative together, and celebrating a good harvest together. By midday, the couple returns home carrying tools and baskets. Bread is broken. Cheese is shared. A simple pottage simmers over the fire. An older woman from the neighboring cottage visits briefly to exchange herbs and ask whether the newly married wife has learned the best place to store grain away from dampness. She offers advice about preserving cabbage for winter and smiles gently before leaving. Such visits were common. Knowledge about marriage was often practical rather than romantic. Experienced married people taught younger couples how to manage a household, care for animals, preserve food, and navigate the countless small challenges of daily life. The transition into adulthood was supported by the wisdom of those who had already lived through many seasons. As afternoon light fills the cottage, the husband repairs a wooden stool while the wife spins wool beside the window. They begin talking about the future. Will they need another storage chest before next harvest? Should they plant more beans in the spring? How many chickens can they reasonably keep through the winter? Will there be enough linen for future children if children come? These conversations reveal the medieval understanding of marriage as a long journey. The first sexual experience was connected to fertility and family, but medieval people also understood that children might not come immediately, or might not come at all. Illness, miscarriage, infant mortality, and uncertainty were part of life. Hope existed alongside realism. Outside, clouds gather and a light rain begins to fall. The couple brings in firewood and closes the shutters against the wind. The room grows warmer as the fire is stirred back to life. Rain taps softly against the roof while evening approaches. Imagine them sitting together in the fading light. One mends a cloak. The other braids rope from dried fibers. They speak quietly about the wedding feast, laughing at a cousin who danced too enthusiastically and an uncle who sang the same old song 3 times. The nervousness of the first night has begun to fade into something gentler, familiarity. Historians often caution against assuming that medieval marriages were either cold arrangements or perfect romances. The reality was probably far more varied. Some couples loved each other deeply. Some grew into affection gradually. Some struggled. Some were unhappy. But many ordinary marriages appear to have contained companionship, mutual dependence, and shared purpose. As darkness settles outside, the church bell rings for evening prayer. The couple pauses for a moment of quiet reflection before returning to their work. Faith was woven into the fabric of medieval life, and many households marked the passing of the day with prayer, however simple. Marriage was understood not only as a social contract but also as a sacred commitment, and that belief shaped the way many people thought about intimacy, responsibility, and family life. The rain stops. The clouds drift away. Stars appear above the village once more. The fire burns low, and the couple prepares for sleep. Tomorrow will bring more ordinary tasks: water to carry, bread to bake, tools to repair, neighbors to greet, and perhaps another small disagreement to resolve with patience and kindness. This, too, is part of the story. For countless ordinary people across medieval Europe, the days after losing their virginity were not filled with dramatic transformation. Instead, they were filled with repetition, cooperation, learning, and the slow discovery that marriage was built from ordinary moments shared faithfully over time. Years later, an old husband and wife might remember their wedding with affection, but they would remember even more clearly the thousands of mornings that followed it. They would remember the first winter they survived together, the roof they repaired, the harvest that failed, the harvest that succeeded, the child who learned to walk across the same earthen floor, and the evenings spent beside the same familiar fire. The church bell sounds one final time across the dark fields. The village sleeps peacefully beneath the stars. And inside one small cottage, another ordinary medieval couple continues learning the quiet art of living together, discovering that the true meaning of marriage was not contained in a single night, but in the countless gentle days that followed it, season after season, year after year. The different paths of medieval people: peasants, townspeople, and artisans. The seasons continue their quiet turning. Winter has loosened its grip upon the land, and the first signs of spring have begun to appear across the fields of medieval Europe. The streams run a little faster, birds return to the hedgerows, and farmers walk their land with the thoughtful expressions of people who know that another year of labor is about to begin. The village is waking once more, and with it comes a gentle reminder that medieval Europe was not one single place with one single custom. As we have traveled through the earlier chapters, we have followed the path that many ordinary people took: childhood, work, courtship, betrothal, the wedding ceremony, the wedding night, and the first quiet weeks of married life. But medieval Europe was a vast and varied world stretching across kingdoms, languages, landscapes, and traditions. A shepherd in the mountains, a baker in a busy town, a blacksmith in a market village, and a merchant's daughter near a river port might all have lived within the same century, yet their experiences could differ in surprising ways. Tonight, let us walk gently through that diversity. Imagine that you are standing at the edge of a country road at dawn. Behind you lies a small farming village much like the one we have visited throughout this story. Ahead, the road leads toward a market town with stone walls, workshops, narrow streets, and the constant sound of trade. Far beyond that are larger cities, castles, monasteries, and ports where ships arrive from distant lands. The further you travel, the more you begin to understand that there was no single medieval experience. And yet, despite these differences, one pattern appears again and again. For the great majority of ordinary people, the first sexual experience was still closely connected to marriage. Let us begin with the peasants, who made up the largest part of the medieval population. Their lives were shaped by the land. Spring planting, summer labor, autumn harvest, and winter repair formed the cycle of every year. A young peasant usually spent childhood helping the family survive, tending animals, carrying water, gathering fuel, spinning wool, or working in the fields. Marriage often came only when a couple had some realistic chance of supporting a household. This is important because it means that many peasant men and women did not marry as early as popular myths suggest. In many regions of late medieval Europe, especially in parts of northwestern Europe, Women often married in their late teens or early 20s, while men frequently married in their 20s after acquiring land, tools, livestock, or employment. Imagine a young farming couple in such a village. They have known each other for years. They met during harvest, spoke after church, helped one another during communal work, and gradually earned the approval of their families. Their wedding is simple. Their house is small. Their possessions are few. When they lose their virginity after marriage, the event is understood primarily as the beginning of a household. The next morning they will still need to feed animals, mend tools, and prepare for the coming season. Now let us continue walking toward the town. The road becomes busier. Carts filled with grain, cloth, timber, and pottery pass by. The smell of smoke grows stronger. Church towers rise above clusters of houses, and the sound of hammers echoes from workshops. Here live artisans and craftspeople, blacksmiths, carpenters, shoemakers, weavers, bakers, masons, and many others whose skills shaped medieval urban life. Their path toward marriage could be somewhat different. A young apprentice might spend years learning a trade under a master craftsman. During this period, marriage was often postponed. An apprentice usually lived in the master's household, followed strict rules, and possessed little independent property. Only after completing training and becoming a journeyman or eventually a master might marriage become economically possible. This delay had important consequences. A craftsman might be older when he married than a village farmer. His first sexual experience, if he followed the ideal expected by church and community, would therefore occur later in life. Medieval records suggest that economic readiness frequently influenced the timing of marriage, especially in towns where guilds and workshops played a major role. Imagine a young weaver who has spent 7 years learning the craft. He rents a small room near the workshop, saves money carefully, and dreams of opening a workshop of his own. Only when he has enough resources does he begin seeking a wife. The woman he marries may have worked in textile production herself, helping her family spin, weave, dye, or sell cloth. Their marriage joins not only two people but also two sets of skills. The wedding night is important, but the loom waiting in the workshop tomorrow morning is important as well. For artisans, marriage was often the formation of a working partnership. A wife might help manage accounts, sell goods in the market, supervise apprentices, or continue producing textiles, food, candles, or other household products. The household and the workplace were frequently connected, and the beginning of sexual life was therefore intertwined with the beginning of economic cooperation. As afternoon light falls across the market square, let us observe another group, townspeople who are neither wealthy merchants nor poor laborers, but ordinary urban families. Their lives are more crowded than those of villagers. Streets are narrow. Neighbors live close together. Churches, taverns, bakeries, and workshops stand within a short walk of one another. Privacy is often limited. This reminds us that medieval intimacy usually existed within communities where many aspects of life were visible to others. Families, neighbors, guild members, and parish priests all played roles in observing reputation and supporting marriage. A town wedding might involve guild customs, neighborhood celebrations, or parish traditions that differed from those of a farming village. Yet the underlying expectation remained familiar: sexual relations properly belonged within marriage, and the first sexual experience was ideally expected to occur after the couple had been publicly recognized as husband and wife. Historians are careful to note that real life did not always follow the ideal. Church court records contain evidence of premarital relationships, broken engagement promises, disputed paternity, and couples who considered themselves married before a formal ceremony had taken place. Medieval people were human beings with desires, mistakes, hopes, and complications. But what is striking is how often these records revolve around marriage. People argued over whether a promise had created a valid marriage. They sought recognition of unions. They appealed to church courts because marriage carried legal and social consequences. This tells us that the connection between virginity and marriage was deeply embedded in medieval society. As evening approaches, the market begins to close. Stalls are dismantled. Animals are led home. The smell of fresh bread mixes with wood smoke drifting through the streets. A blacksmith locks his workshop. A baker counts the day's earnings. A weaver folds unfinished cloth. Across village and town alike, families gather around evening fires. Some homes are larger than others. Some meals are richer than others. Some people own land while others rent rooms. Yet countless households share the same quiet understanding: marriage has begun, and with it has begun the intimate partnership from which future generations may grow. Imagine the lights of many homes appearing one by one across the landscape. In one cottage a farming couple plans spring planting. In another, a carpenter and his wife discuss a new commission. In a townhouse, a baker's family prepares dough for the morning. In a weaver's workshop, a newly married couple sits beside the loom, speaking softly before sleep. Different paths have led them here. Different occupations, different customs, different rhythms of life. Yet for many of them, the loss of virginity has been woven into the same larger story: the creation of a household, the acceptance of responsibility, and the beginning of a shared future. The stars rise above fields and rooftops alike. The bells of distant churches echo through the evening air. And medieval Europe, with all its diversity, settles once more into peaceful darkness, carrying within it countless ordinary marriages, each beginning in its own way, yet all connected by the quiet hope that tomorrow will bring another day of shared work, shared bread, and shared life. The different paths of medieval people. Nobles, merchants, and the many roads to marriage. The night has passed peacefully, and another dawn arrives across medieval Europe. Mist gathers over rivers and meadows, while the first light touches castle towers, monastery roofs, market squares, and distant farms. From the countryside, smoke rises from humble cottages; from the towns, the sound of carts and merchants slowly begins to fill the streets. As we continue our journey, it becomes clear that medieval Europe was not one single world, but many overlapping worlds connected by roads, rivers, churches, and traditions. In the previous chapter, we walked among peasants, artisans, and townspeople, discovering that for many ordinary people the first sexual experience was closely connected to marriage and the beginning of a household. Today we continue that journey by looking toward families whose lives were shaped not only by work, but also by trade, property, and social rank. Imagine yourself traveling along a busy market road. You pass wagons loaded with cloth, salt, grain, wine, timber, and pottery. Pilgrims walk toward distant shrines, monks travel between monasteries, and merchants move from one town to another carrying goods from regions you may never see. Medieval Europe was far more connected than many people imagine, and these connections created different paths toward marriage. Let us first enter the world of merchant families. A merchant's household was often busier than a farming cottage. Goods arrived and departed regularly. Accounts had to be kept. Apprentices or servants might live within the home. The family's prosperity depended not only on harvests, but also on trade, credit, and relationships with other towns. A daughter in such a household might learn reading, basic accounting, textile work, food management, and the practical skills required to help run a commercial household. A son might travel with relatives, learn bargaining, weights and measures, foreign currencies, and the customs of different markets. Marriage in merchant families was frequently influenced by business considerations. Affection could certainly exist, and many couples undoubtedly cared deeply for one another, but parents often looked carefully at reputation, financial stability, family connections, and the ability to contribute to the household economy. A marriage could strengthen trading relationships, unite property, or help establish a new workshop or business. Imagine a young merchant who has spent several years traveling between towns. He has learned the routes, the fares, and the language of trade. Only after returning with enough savings and the approval of his family does marriage become realistic. The woman he marries has likely been prepared for years to manage servants, oversee food stores, supervise textile production, and maintain household accounts. Their wedding is somewhat richer than that of a poor farming family. The feast may include finer bread, imported spices, better wine, or more elaborate clothing. Yet the deeper meaning remains familiar. The marriage creates a new household, and the expectation is that husband and wife will now share responsibility for its future. For many merchant families, as for peasants and artisans, the first sexual experience was understood within the framework of marriage. The setting may have been more prosperous, but the social meaning was remarkably similar: a publicly recognized union, a shared household, and the hope of future generations. As we continue our journey, the road climbs toward a fortified hill where a stone castle overlooks the surrounding countryside. Here we enter the world of the nobility. Medieval nobles lived very differently from ordinary villagers. They managed estates, collected rents, oversaw servants and laborers, and participated in networks of power that stretched across kingdoms. Their marriages could involve land, inheritance, military alliances, and political strategy in ways that rarely affected peasant households. It is true that noble marriages were often arranged more formally than those of ordinary villagers. Families negotiated dowries, property rights, inheritance, and alliances. A marriage could unite estates, settle disputes, or strengthen relationships between powerful families. Yet it would be misleading to imagine that every noble marriage lacked affection. Medieval letters and chronicles contain many examples of tenderness, grief at the loss of a spouse, and genuine emotional attachment between noble husbands and wives. Imagine a young noblewoman walking through a castle courtyard. She has been taught manners, household management, religious devotion, and the responsibilities of overseeing servants and estate life. A young nobleman has been trained in riding, warfare, administration, hunting, and the management of lands and tenants. When they marry, the ceremony is grander than that of a village couple. More guests attend. Richer fabrics appear. Music is louder. The feast lasts longer. Yet after the celebration ends, they too withdraw from the public eye and begin the private life of marriage. This is an important reminder. Although social class influenced almost every aspect of medieval life, the transition from unmarried to married status remained significant across society. Whether in a cottage, a town house, or a castle chamber, marriage marked the point at which sexual relations were expected to become legitimate and socially recognized. As afternoon light falls across the castle walls, let us pause to consider another common misconception. Many people imagine that medieval brides were always extremely young. In reality, the situation varied greatly. Some noble marriages were arranged at young ages, especially for political reasons, but the marriage might not be fully lived as a husband and wife relationship immediately. Among ordinary people, especially in many parts of later medieval northwestern Europe, marriage often occurred later than popular myths suggest. Economic readiness mattered enormously. This means that there was no single medieval age at which people lost their virginity. A peasant woman might marry at 18. An artisan might marry at 25. A merchant's son might marry after establishing a business. A noble marriage might follow a different timeline altogether. The diversity of medieval Europe is one of its most fascinating features. As evening approaches, imagine leaving the castle and returning toward the valley. You pass monasteries where monks and nuns have chosen lives of celibacy, reminding us that not everyone in medieval Europe married at all. The Church honored both marriage and religious celibacy, and some men and women deliberately chose a life without sexual relations. Their existence further highlights that virginity in medieval Europe was understood through religious ideas as well as social ones. The road leads once more through villages and towns. Candles begin appearing in windows. Church bells ring for evening prayer. Families gather around tables large and small. In one house, a merchant couple counts coins and records transactions. In another, a noble household discusses estate matters. In another, a farmer and his wife plan tomorrow's planting. Different worlds. Different responsibilities. Different levels of wealth. Yet all are connected by the medieval understanding that marriage was the proper beginning of shared intimate life. Historians who examine wills, legal records, parish registers, household accounts, and church court documents repeatedly encounter the same broad pattern. Human behavior varied widely, and not everyone followed the ideal. Premarital relationships existed. Broken promises existed. Scandals existed. But the cultural expectation that sexual life belonged within marriage remained remarkably powerful across much of medieval Europe. As darkness settles over the landscape, the distinctions between castle and cottage become less visible. The same stars shine above all of them. The same moonlight touches stone walls and thatched roofs alike. The same church bells echo across fields, forests, rivers, and towns. A newly married noble couple sits beside a large fireplace. A merchant husband and wife close the shutters of their house. A farming couple checks the animals before sleep. Each has arrived by a different road. Each belongs to a different social world. Yet for many of them, the loss of virginity has marked the same quiet threshold, the beginning of a household, the acceptance of responsibility, and the hope that tomorrow, and all the tomorrows that follow, will be faced together. The fires burn lower. The roads grow silent. Medieval Europe rests beneath the stars, carrying within it countless different lives and countless different marriages, all woven into the same long story of how people entered adulthood, partnership, and the shared future that marriage was meant to begin. When reality did not match the ideal. Promises that were broken. The night is calm again. A gentle rain has passed over the fields, leaving the earth dark and fragrant, and the roads that connect the villages and towns of medieval Europe glisten softly beneath the moonlight. The church bells have long since fallen silent, and only the distant sound of water moving through a mill stream can be heard. It is in this quiet hour that we arrive at one of the most human chapters of our journey. Until now, we have followed the path that medieval society hoped most people would take: childhood, work, courtship, family approval, betrothal, marriage, and the beginning of married life. That path was real, and for many ordinary people it was indeed the road they traveled. But medieval Europe was not a world of perfect obedience or flawless customs. It was a world inhabited by real human beings, and real human beings often loved unwisely, trusted too easily, hesitated too long, or found themselves caught between hope and circumstance. To understand how people lost their virginity in medieval Europe, we must also understand what happened when the expected path toward marriage did not unfold as planned. Imagine yourself once more in a small village somewhere in medieval Europe. The cottages are familiar, the fields stretch quietly into the distance, and the church stands at the center of the community as it always has. Yet beneath the peaceful appearance of the village, there are stories that are rarely sung at festivals and seldom carved into church walls. There is the story of a young couple who believed they would marry. There is the story of a promise made beside a river or beneath an old tree after evening prayers. There is the story of families who could not agree. There is the story of illness, poverty, military service, or a failed harvest that changed everything. For many medieval people, the greatest danger was not always temptation itself. It was uncertainty. a young man and woman might spend years expecting that they would become husband and wife. They might work together during harvest, meet after church, exchange gifts, and speak of the future with complete sincerity. Their neighbors might already think of them as a future household. Their families might even have begun discussing practical arrangements. And yet, medieval life was fragile. A father could die unexpectedly. A dowry could become impossible. A workshop could fail. A war could begin. A journey could separate two people for years. A promise that once seemed certain could gradually become uncertain. This is where many of the surviving medieval church records become surprisingly moving. Historians who read these records often encounter ordinary voices speaking across the centuries. A woman tells the court that a man promised to marry her. The man replies that no binding promise was made. Witnesses are called. Neighbors testify about conversations they overheard. Friends remember whether hands were joined, whether rings were exchanged, whether words of present consent were spoken. These documents reveal a remarkable truth. Many medieval people took marriage promises extremely seriously. Because spoken consent could carry legal and religious significance, a broken promise was not always merely a personal disappointment. It could become a matter for the church itself. Ecclesiastical courts across medieval Europe heard countless cases involving disputed engagements, alleged marriage contracts, and relationships that had not followed the expected path. Imagine a young woman walking slowly toward the church. The morning mist still lies across the fields, and she carries no basket or tool today. Instead, she carries uncertainty. She had believed that the wedding would happen before winter. Her family had begun preparing linen and household goods. Neighbors had already offered quiet congratulations. Now the young man has left for another town in search of work. Letters are rare. Travel is slow. Months pass. No wedding is announced. For medieval women especially, such uncertainty could be frightening because reputation mattered deeply. A woman known to be betrothed occupied a different social position from a woman whose promised marriage had collapsed. Families worried not only about emotional sorrow, but also about future marriage prospects, property arrangements, and social standing. This is one reason why virginity was connected to more than the body. It was connected to trust. A marriage promise implied a future household, shared labor, children, and security. When that promise was broken, the loss could affect an entire life. As the sun rises higher, imagine the village continuing its ordinary work. Bread is baked. Animals are fed. Children play beside the well. The seasons do not stop for personal grief. This quiet continuation is perhaps one of the saddest realities of medieval life. Even when hearts were broken, fields still needed planting, roofs still needed repair, and families still needed food. Yet medieval society was not without compassion. Neighbors sometimes helped. Relatives offered support. Priests attempted reconciliation. Families negotiated new arrangements. Not every broken promise ended in ruin. Some couples eventually married after long delays. Others found different partners. Some entered religious life. Some remained unmarried. Human lives were as varied then as they are now. As afternoon light fills the village lane, let us consider another important historical reality. Although the Church taught that sexual relations belonged within marriage, historians know that premarital relationships did occur. Church court records, legal documents, and local customs all provide evidence that some engaged couples became intimate before a formal wedding had taken place, especially when they already considered themselves effectively promised to one another. This is a delicate subject, and medieval people themselves treated it delicately. Such relationships could be viewed differently depending on local custom, family response, and whether marriage eventually followed. In some cases, the couple did indeed marry, and the earlier intimacy became absorbed into the larger story of the marriage. In other cases, when marriage failed to occur, the consequences could be much more serious, particularly for women. This helps us answer our central question more honestly. Did everyone in medieval Europe lose their virginity on their wedding night? No. The historical evidence does not support such a simple answer. What it does suggest is that the cultural ideal remained powerful. Most communities expected sexual relations to belong within marriage, and many people clearly organized their lives around that expectation. But human reality sometimes departed from the ideal, and when it did, the church, families, and local communities often became involved. As evening approaches, the rain begins again. A soft drizzle falls across the fields, and the village grows quiet. Inside a small cottage, an elderly woman tells a younger relative that promises should never be spoken lightly. Words, she says, can build a house, and they can also leave one empty. Her wisdom reflects centuries of experience. In a world where spoken vows carried extraordinary importance, trust was one of the greatest treasures a person could possess. The first sexual experience, when it occurred before marriage, was often entangled with that trust. It might arise from a genuine expectation of marriage rather than casual pleasure. This is one of the reasons historians resist simple stereotypes about medieval sexuality. The evidence reveals not a society without desire, nor a society consumed by desire, but a society that tried to place desire within a framework of marriage, family, faith, and community. The rain stops. The clouds slowly part. Stars begin appearing above the dark fields once more. The church bell rings a single evening hour, and its echo travels across the quiet countryside. Somewhere in the village, a couple is happily preparing for a wedding. Somewhere else, another couple is wondering whether their promise will ever be fulfilled. Both stories belong to medieval Europe. Both stories help us understand how people reached, or sometimes failed to reach, the moment when they would lose their virginity. And both stories remind us that behind every historical custom were ordinary human beings, living patiently through hope, uncertainty, love, and the slow passage of the seasons. What the church records remembered. The rain has passed during the night. When morning comes, the fields are bright with dew, and the village seems freshly washed by the gentle weather. Birds call from the hedgerows, smoke rises from the chimneys, and the familiar bell of the parish church marks the beginning of another ordinary day. Medieval Europe often appears peaceful from a distance, and in many ways it was a world built upon routines that repeated year after year. Yet beneath those routines lay thousands of personal stories, some joyful, some sorrowful, and many far more complicated than the ideal of courtship followed by marriage. Imagine walking along a road that leads not only through villages and towns, but also through the archives of medieval Europe. Behind the stone walls of churches, monasteries, and ecclesiastical courts, scribes patiently copied testimonies onto parchment. They recorded disputes, promises, inheritances, marriages, and moments of conflict that otherwise would have vanished forever. Centuries later, historians opened these records and discovered something remarkable: ordinary people had left behind their voices. These voices are often surprisingly familiar. A young woman says that a man promised to marry her before witnesses. A young man insists that the promise was misunderstood. Neighbors describe what they saw after a harvest feast. An elderly widow remembers a conversation that took place years earlier. A priest asks careful questions about consent, intention, and reputation. Through these records, medieval people step quietly into the present. The important lesson is not that medieval society was secretly rebellious or endlessly scandalous. The records survive precisely because something unusual happened. Most ordinary marriages left few traces beyond parish registers, property documents, or family memories. Court cases, by contrast, preserved the moments when life failed to follow the expected path. As we continue our journey through the question of how people lost their virginity in medieval Europe, these records help us understand that the ideal and the reality were not always identical. The Church taught that sexual relations belonged within marriage. Families generally hoped that sons and daughters would marry before beginning intimate life. Communities often valued a good reputation and expected engaged couples to behave with restraint. But historians who study medieval church courts have found evidence that some couples became intimate before a formal wedding had taken place, especially when they already considered themselves bound by a serious promise of marriage. Imagine a young couple standing beside a river at sunset. They have known each other since childhood. Their families have spoken favorably. They expect to marry in the spring after enough grain has been stored and a small house has been prepared. To them, the future seems certain. If such a couple crossed the boundaries that society hoped they would wait to cross, they often did not think of themselves as strangers acting recklessly. They might think of themselves as future husband and wife whose marriage was already morally real, even if the public ceremony had not yet occurred. This distinction appears repeatedly in medieval records. Many disputes centered not simply on whether a couple had been intimate, but on whether a valid promise of marriage had existed. Consent mattered enormously. The Church gradually developed a sophisticated understanding of marriage in which the free agreement of the man and woman was essential. A forced marriage was deeply problematic under canon law. This meant that church courts often investigated conversations, gestures, witnesses, and the exact words that had been spoken. Did the couple say, "I will marry you"? Or did they say, "I take you as my husband," or "I take you as my wife"? To modern ears, the difference may seem small. To medieval lawyers and priests, it could be extremely important. As the morning grows warmer, imagine entering a stone church where a hearing is taking place. The room is cool and quiet. A scribe dips a quill into ink. Witnesses wait patiently. The priest listens more carefully than dramatically. These were not theatrical trials in the modern sense. They were often slow, methodical attempts to determine what had actually happened between two ordinary people. A woman may explain that she trusted a promise because the man placed a ring upon her finger. A neighbor may testify that the couple had long been regarded as intended for one another. A relative may admit that the wedding was delayed because a harvest failed or because money for a dowry could not be gathered. What emerges from these records is a portrait of medieval society that is deeply human. People hoped. People trusted. People delayed weddings because of poverty, illness, war, or family obligations. People misunderstood one another. People changed their minds. And sometimes, people suffered because a promise they believed to be certain was never fulfilled. This is especially important for understanding women's experiences. A woman whose expected marriage collapsed could face practical difficulties as well as emotional pain. Future marriage negotiations might become more complicated. Family relationships could be strained. Economic security could be threatened. The church courts therefore became places where some women sought recognition of promises they believed had already created a true marriage. As afternoon light falls across the fields, the village continues its ordinary work. A blacksmith shapes iron. A baker removes loaves from an oven. Children gather kindling. Life goes on, even while private worries remain hidden inside individual households. This quiet contrast between public routine and private uncertainty is one of the most moving aspects of medieval history. The records also remind us that medieval Europe was not morally uniform. Local customs differed. Urban communities sometimes behaved differently from rural villages. Some regions enforced social expectations more strictly than others. Some families were more forgiving. Some priests were more compassionate. There was no single medieval experience. Yet across this diversity, one broad pattern remains visible. For many ordinary people, the first sexual experience was still expected to occur within a relationship understood to be marriage or very close to marriage. Even when couples departed from the ideal, they often did so within the context of a serious commitment rather than casual encounter. As evening approaches, imagine an elderly priest closing a large parchment book after a long day of hearings. He has listened to stories of hope, misunderstanding, love, poverty, delay, and reconciliation. He knows that human lives are rarely as orderly as rules. He also knows that communities need customs, promises, and institutions to help people live together. Outside, the church bell rings across the fields. The same sound reaches cottages, workshops, inns, farms, and distant travelers on the road. The village gathers once more for evening prayer, and for a little while the differences between households seem smaller. A married couple sits quietly beside the fire. An engaged couple waits patiently for spring. A widow remembers a husband long gone. A young person wonders what the future will bring. All of them belong to the same medieval world. The stars appear one by one above the dark countryside. The fields rest peacefully beneath the night sky. The church records, now closed and stored safely away, preserve countless stories that will sleep for centuries before being read again. They do not tell us that everyone followed the ideal. Nor do they tell us that no one did. Instead, they reveal something gentler and more truthful, that medieval people were ordinary human beings who tried to place love, desire, trust, and family within the framework of marriage and community, and that the journey toward losing one's virginity was often shaped by promises that were hoped for, prepared for, delayed, fulfilled, or sometimes painfully broken. The village grows still. The fire burns low. The bell falls silent. And medieval Europe settles once more into peaceful darkness, carrying within it both the ideals it cherished and the imperfect lives through which those ideals were lived. A lifetime remembered. Looking back on youth. The years have passed quietly. The fields that were once harvested by young hands are now tended by another generation. The children who ran laughing between the cottages have become adults, and many of the elders whose voices once guided the village have long since been buried beneath weathered stones in the churchyard. The church bell still rings across the countryside, just as it did when we began our journey, and the seasons continue their patient turning without haste or interruption. Imagine yourself now as an old person somewhere in medieval Europe. You sit beside a familiar hearth whose stones have been warmed by countless winters. A wooden chair creaks softly beneath you. The fire burns gently, and outside the window the evening sky is filled with the pale gold light of late autumn. Your hands bear the marks of decades of work, and your memories have become quieter than they were in youth. When old age comes, people rarely remember only the dramatic moments. They remember the ordinary ones. The smell of fresh bread before dawn. The sound of geese crossing a field. The feel of wool between the fingers while spinning beside the fire. The church bell on winter mornings. The path walked so many times that it became part of the body itself. And among those memories is the memory of youth and the long journey that led toward marriage. Looking back across a lifetime, the first thing you remember is not the wedding itself. It is the village. The place where everyone knew your name. The place where neighbors watched children become adults, where families shared tools and harvest labor, and where reputation was built slowly through years of work and kindness. In youth, the village had seemed ordinary. In old age, it seems precious. You remember carrying water from the well before sunrise. You remember working in the fields during harvest until your hands ached. You remember festivals where lanterns glowed against the evening sky and music drifted across the green. You remember standing near the church door after Sunday Mass, speaking with someone whose face gradually became more familiar than all the others. At the time, you did not know that these small moments were changing your life. This is perhaps the greatest surprise of old age. The turning points are often invisible when they happen. A conversation, a shared walk, a borrowed tool, a smile across a market square, a season spent working side by side. Only later do you realize that a future household was quietly being formed. You remember your parents watching more carefully than you understood. You remember older women asking whether you had learned to bake, brew, spin, weave, or manage a household. You remember older men speaking about fields, tools, weather, and responsibility. At the time, these conversations seemed ordinary. Now you understand that they were preparing you for marriage. Medieval Europe expected most ordinary people to marry, and that expectation shaped childhood itself. Skills were taught not only for survival, but for future household life. The path toward losing one's virginity did not begin on a wedding night. It began years earlier, when families slowly prepared sons and daughters for adulthood. You remember the uncertainty. Would there be enough land? Enough money? Enough grain? Enough work? A marriage required more than affection. It required a way to live. Looking back, you realize how much of youth was spent waiting for practical readiness. Harvests had to succeed. Apprenticeships had to be completed. Houses had to be repaired. Livestock had to be gathered. The future depended on ordinary things. You remember the betrothal, the spoken promise, the hands joined before witnesses, the feeling that the world had suddenly become both larger and more fragile. A promise carried weight in medieval Europe. Families heard it. Neighbors remembered it. The church blessed it. Looking back, you understand why people treated words so carefully. A household could be built upon them. You remember the wedding morning, the cold air, the smell of wood smoke, the best clothes you owned, the church standing quietly at the center of the village, the priest asking whether you came freely, the moment when you spoke words that changed how everyone around you saw you. In memory, the ceremony has become simpler than it seemed at the time. The details fade. The feeling remains. You remember the feast. Bread passed from hand to hand. Laughter rising into the evening air. Children running between tables. An elderly relative giving practical advice disguised as a blessing. A neighbor presenting a blanket, a cooking pot, a wooden chest, or a handful of coins. At the time, these gifts seemed small. Now you understand that they were pieces of a future home. And then you remember the first quiet evening after the celebration. The village finally silent. The fire burning low. The realization that tomorrow would not be another festival. Tomorrow would be the first ordinary day of married life. This is the memory that surprises you most. When you were young, you thought the wedding night was the great destination. When you became old, you realized it was the doorway. For most ordinary medieval Europeans, the first sexual experience was remembered less as a dramatic event and more as the beginning of a shared life. The years afterward mattered far more than the single evening itself. You remember learning together. Who woke first? Who preferred the warmer side of the fire? How grain should be stored? How roofs leak during heavy rain? How difficult winters could become? How comforting another person's steady presence could be when illness entered the house? You remember disagreements that seemed enormous at the time and now seem almost gentle. You remember repairing fences, carrying water, baking bread, planting beans, harvesting grain, and watching seasons repeat so many times that the years began to blend together. Perhaps children came. Perhaps they did not. Perhaps some survived and others did not. medieval life was uncertain, and joy often lived beside sorrow. Looking back, you remember both with surprising tenderness. You remember neighbors who helped when the harvest failed, relatives who brought food during sickness, friends who stood beside you at baptisms and funerals. Marriage was never only about two people. It was about being woven into a community that shared burdens across generations. The fire beside you burned softly. Outside, evening has deepened into night. A grandchild sits nearby, listening as you tell stories that begin with the words, "When I was young." You do not tell them dramatic tales of passion. You tell them about work, about patience, about promises, about kindness, about how frightened and hopeful young people can be at the same time. You tell them that love often grows through ordinary days, that a household is built slowly, that marriage is less a single event than a lifetime of shared mornings. As the stars appear above the village, you realize that your memories have formed a circle. You began as a child listening to the stories of older people. Now you have become one of those older people. The same church bell still rings across the fields. The same seasons still return. The same paths are still walked by young feet that do not yet know where they are leading. And somewhere in the village, another couple is beginning the journey that you began so many years ago, moving quietly from youth toward marriage, from promise toward partnership, and from the first uncertain days of adulthood into the long, peaceful work of building a life together. The fire settles into glowing embers. The night grows still, and the memories of a lifetime rest gently beside you, as calm and enduring as the medieval stars above the sleeping fields. The quiet truth. The fire has burned lower now. The room is filled with the soft glow of embers, and the sounds of the village have almost disappeared. Somewhere outside, a gate closes gently, a horse shifts in its stall, and the wind moves through the bare branches of an old tree that has stood longer than anyone can remember. The church bell has marked the final hour of the evening, and the quiet that settles across the fields feels familiar, as though it has returned every night for a lifetime. Imagine yourself still seated beside the hearth, many decades after the day you first stood before the church and spoke your marriage vows. Your hair has turned silver, your hands are lined with years of work, and the memories of youth have become softer around the edges. The details are not always perfectly clear, but the feeling of those years remains. When people grow old, they often discover that the stories they tell become simpler. The grand events fade. The ordinary moments remain. You remember carrying water together before sunrise. You remember walking home from the fields while the sky turned pink with evening light. You remember sharing bread that had been baked that morning, mending clothing beside the fire, and listening to rain on the roof during long autumn nights. You remember the winters that seemed endless, the springs that arrived suddenly with birdsong and blossoms, and the harvests that filled the barns with relief and gratitude. Looking back, the first night of marriage no longer stands alone. It has become part of a much larger landscape of memory. This is perhaps the quiet truth that medieval Europe leaves behind. For most ordinary people, losing one's virginity was not remembered as a dramatic adventure, a scandalous secret, or a heroic achievement. It was remembered, if it was remembered at all, as one step in the beginning of a household. The memory of that first night is intertwined with the memory of the first winter together, the first crop planted together, the first roof repaired together, and the first time illness entered the home and was faced together. The intimate beginning of marriage mattered because it belonged to everything that came afterward. You remember how uncertain you were. You remember wondering whether you would be a good husband or a good wife, whether there would be enough grain for winter, whether the small house would be warm enough, and whether you were ready for responsibilities that seemed larger than yourself. Youth often believes that certainty comes before adulthood. Age teaches that certainty rarely comes at all. You remember learning slowly. No one had explained everything. Older relatives had offered advice, but much remained unspoken. You discovered one another's habits gradually. You learned how the other person worked, rested, worried, laughed, and prayed. You learned that affection was not always expressed in words. Sometimes it appeared in a repaired shoe, a bowl of warm pottage, a blanket placed quietly over sleeping shoulders, or a field finished before rain arrived. Historians who study medieval households often find evidence of this quiet partnership. Account books, wills, property transfers, guild records, and parish documents reveal husbands and wives working together across decades. A wife managed stores of grain, supervised servants or children, spun wool, brewed ale, sold goods, and kept the household running. A husband farmed, traded, built, repaired, negotiated, and labored in fields or workshops. Their work was different, but it was deeply connected. Marriage was not only a romantic union. It was a shared economy, a shared shelter, a shared future. You remember neighbors who married around the same time. Some were blessed with many children. Some buried infants in the churchyard. Some lost husbands to illness. Some lost wives during childbirth. Some remained together into old age, walking slowly to church each Sunday, leaning on one another as the years passed. Medieval Europe was filled with joy and sorrow living side by side. This is why the first sexual experience carried such a different meaning from many modern assumptions. It was closely tied to fertility, inheritance, family continuity, and the hope that another generation would someday walk the same village paths. You remember how the village watched. Not cruelly, but attentively. Neighbors noticed whether a roof was repaired, whether fields were well kept, whether children were cared for, whether a couple seemed to treat one another with respect. Reputation continued long after the wedding feast ended. The first night of marriage had been private, but married life itself was lived in the sight of the community. You remember the church bells. They marked every stage of life. The bells rang when you were baptized. They rang when you were married. They rang when children were christened. They rang at funerals. They rang during storms and feast days and ordinary Sundays. The same bells that sounded on your wedding day continued sounding through the decades until they became the music of your entire life. Outside the cottage, the moon has risen. Its light falls across the fields that have been planted and harvested so many times that individual seasons are difficult to separate in memory. You think of all the young people who have grown up since your own youth. They laugh at festivals, meet after church, help one another during harvest, and wonder quietly what marriage will be like. You wish you could tell them something simple. Perhaps you do. You tell them that marriage is built from ordinary mornings. You tell them that kindness matters more than pride. You tell them that patience lasts longer than excitement. You tell them that the first night is only the beginning. You tell them that love often grows while carrying water, tending animals, baking bread, repairing tools, and surviving winters together. This wisdom would have sounded familiar to many medieval elders. Their memories were not shaped primarily by a single intimate moment, but by the thousands of days that followed it. The first sexual experience was meaningful because it marked the opening of a partnership expected to endure through all the ordinary work of life. As the fire becomes a bed of glowing coals, you think about the question that began this entire journey. How did people lose their virginity in medieval Europe? The answer, after all these chapters, is quieter than many stories suggest. Some people did so after long courtships. Some after arranged marriages. Some after delayed engagements. Some after apprenticeships and years of preparation. Some within humble cottages. Some within town houses. Some within manor houses or castles. Some followed the ideal expected by church and community. Some did not. Human lives were varied. Yet for a great many ordinary medieval Europeans, virginity was lost within marriage and understood as the beginning of household life rather than as a separate personal milestone. The room is almost dark now. A grandchild who had been listening has fallen asleep beside the fire. You place another small log upon the embers, not because you need much warmth anymore, but because the gentle crackling sound has accompanied you through nearly every stage of life. Outside, the village sleeps beneath the stars. The same stars that shone on harvest festivals, wedding processions, winter walks, and quiet evenings shared with the person who became your companion through the passing of the years. The church bell sounds once more in the distance. Its echo travels across fields, forests, rivers, and roofs before fading into the night. And in that fading echo lies the final truth of our journey. Medieval Europe was not only a world of rules, rituals, and customs. It was a world of ordinary people who loved imperfectly, worked tirelessly, hoped quietly, and entered married life with more uncertainty than certainty. Their first intimate experience was rarely the end of the story. It was the first page of a much longer story written in bread, firewood, rain, harvests, children, prayers, patience, and the slow turning of the seasons. The embers glow softly. The night remains peaceful. And the long journey through medieval Europe comes gently to rest beneath the same quiet stars with which it began.